The 9,883rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Israel and Jordan to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mrs. Sigrid Kaag, United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process at Interim, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Sigrid Kaag.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, before turning to read the Secretary General's report, I would like to pay homage to my UN colleagues alongside all humanitarian workers in Gaza, be they Palestinian and international. Tragically, on the 19th of March, one UN staff member lost his life. Another 5 UN personnel were injured in strikes at a deconflicted UN site. I grieve with the family of the deceased and wish the injured a speedy recovery. Madam President, I'd also like to express my profound alarm at the resumption of hostilities in Gaza this week, which has already killed hundreds, mostly women and children. And I would like to echo the Secretary General's call for the resumption of serious negotiations for the ceasefire, unimpeded humanitarian access, and for the remaining hostages to be released immediately and unconditionally. Madam President, members of the Security Council, I now turn to the reading of the 33rd report of the Secretary General on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334 of 2016. This report covers the period from the 7th of December to the 13th of March 2025. Security Council Resolution 2334 calls on, and I cite, Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activity in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and to fully respect all of its legal obligations in this regard. End citation. Settlement activity has nevertheless continued at a high rate. During the reporting period, Israeli planning authorities advanced or approved approximately 10,600 housing units in settlements in the occupied West Bank, including 4,920 in East Jerusalem. Tenders were announced for approximately 700 units in the area of the Efrat settlement near Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank. Demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures accelerated across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Citing the lack of Israeli-issued building permits, which are almost impossible for Palestinians to obtain, Israeli authorities demolished, seized, sealed, or forced people to demolish 460 structures, displacing 576 persons, including 287 children and 149 women. Security Council Resolution 2334 calls, and I cite, for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror, as well as all acts of provocation and destruction. End citation. Unfortunately, the high number of fatal incidents across the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel precludes from detailing all. Madam President, in Gaza, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health, at least 1,897 Palestinians were killed, and at least 5,979 were injured during the reporting period. According to Israeli sources, 59 hostages are still alive, being held captive. 251 hostages were abducted on the 7th of October by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. Israeli sources also report 30 Israel Defense Forces soldiers killed and at least 3 injured during the reporting period. From 7th of December until the ceasefire and hostage release deal took effect on 19th of January, hostilities in Gaza continued, resulting in high numbers of Palestinian casualties, continued massive displacement of civilians and widespread destruction, including to civilian infrastructure. Palestinian armed groups continued to hold hostages in horrific conditions and fired rockets indiscriminately towards Israel. Since the ceasefire took effect on the 19th of January, 25 Israeli and 5 Thai nationals have been released by Hamas and other armed groups, as well as the remains of 8 hostages who were killed on 7th of October or whilst in captivity, amongst them 2 children. Released hostages have described or exhibited signs of serious ill treatment. During the reporting period, 1,777 Palestinian prisoners and detainees were released by Israel. Some reported serious ill treatment, sexual abuse, and humiliation during detention. In the reporting period, at least 21 UN personnel were killed in Gaza. Meanwhile, violence in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continued at alarming levels. 123 Palestinians, including 6 women and 19 children, were killed during ISF airstrikes, operations, armed exchanges, demonstrations, and other incidents. Most Palestinians were killed in the context of Israeli operations in Area A, including during exchanges of fire with armed Palestinians. 924 Palestinians, including 220 children, were injured by the ISF, including 361 by tear gas inhalation and 299 by live ammunition. 117 Palestinians, including 6 children, were injured by settlers. Madam President, according to Israeli sources, 10 Israelis, including 2 children and 3 women, and 5 security services personnel were killed, and another 96, including at least 3 children and 10 women, and 32 ISF personnel were injured by Palestinians in shooting, stabbing, and ramming attacks and other incidents. The ISF arrested 1,711 Palestinians during operations in the occupied West Bank. Israel currently holds at least 9,406 Palestinians, including 3,405 in administrative detention, according to the Israeli Prison Service. On the 19th of February, Israel's military advocate general indicted 5 IDF reservists for serious abuse, including sexual abuse of a Palestinian detainee on the Sdei Teiman facility. On 17th of January, a Palestinian security forces operation that began on the 5th of December against armed groups in the Jenin refugee camp ended with 16 Palestinians killed, including 6 PSF personnel. On the 21st of January, Israel's largest operation in the occupied West Bank since 2002 began and has since expanded across the northern West Bank in what Israeli authorities described as a counter-terrorism operation. This has included the continued use of airstrikes and the deployment of tanks for the first time since 2002, and the demolition of residential buildings and civilian infrastructure and displacing 40,000 people. On the 9th of February, Israeli operations expanded into Nur Shams camp in Tulkarem, where IDF soldiers shot and killed 2 Palestinian women, one of whom was pregnant. 2 Palestinian children were killed by Israeli soldiers in separate incidents in Jenin and Hebron on 21st of February, bringing the total number of children killed to 8 across the occupied West Bank since the operation began. The IDF demolished 23 residential buildings in Jenin refugee camp on the 2nd of February and another 14 in Tulkarem refugee camp on 18th of February, stating it was targeting terrorist infrastructure. The Jenin, Tulkarem and Nur Shams refugee camps have been nearly emptied of their residents. The IDF has also expanded widespread movement restrictions across the occupied West Bank since the 21st of January, including access to essential services and economic activity. On the 23rd of February, the Israeli government stated that the IDF will remain in some of the refugee camps for the coming year and that their residents will not be able to return. Settler-related violence continued throughout the reporting period. Between the 15th and 20th of January alone, for example, large groups of Israeli settlers attacked 11 Palestinian towns and villages across the occupied West Bank, injuring 17 Palestinians, including 2 children, and damaging property. Palestinian attacks against Israelis also continued. In Palestinian shooting attacks on vehicles on the occupied West Bank, a 10-year-old Israeli child was killed and 3 Israelis injured on 11th of December. And 2 elderly Israeli women and 1 policeman were killed and 8 people injured on the 6th of January. Madam President, the Security Council, in its resolution 2334, called upon both parties to refrain from provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric. Unfortunately, such acts have continued. Hamas officials continue to call for violence and attacks against Israelis and encourage escalation throughout the occupied West Bank. Palestinian officials, social media, and media channels continue to glorify the perpetrators of attacks against Israelis. Senior Israeli officials continue to call for the displacement of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, a return to full-scale war, and re-establishment of settlements in Gaza. 2 ministers called on the prime ministers to, citation, open the gates of hell, end of citation, on Gaza if all hostages are not released, taking over the entire strip, removing its population, and cutting off electricity, water, and humanitarian assistance. Some Israeli officials continue to call for the annexation of all or parts of the occupied West Bank. Madam President, Resolution 2334 reiterated calls by the Middle East Quartet for affirmative steps to be taken immediately to reverse negative trends on the ground that are imperiling the 2-state solution. End of citation. When the ceasefire came into force on the 19th of January, the surge in the entry of supplies into Gaza and improved access enabled expanded delivery of life-saving assistance and services across Gaza by UN agencies and other humanitarian actors. Over 57,000 metric tons of food was brought into the Gaza Strip in the first month, and more than 1.9 million people have received food parcels since the ceasefire began. However, since the 2nd of March, the entry of all humanitarian and commercial supplies into Gaza have been halted by the Israeli authorities, severely impacting humanitarian operations. Israel has also cut power to southern Gaza's desalination plant, limiting clean water access for 600,000 people. On the 1st of February, medical evacuations started through Rafah crossing into Egypt. According to the WHO, between 12,000 and 14,000 people, including over 4,500 children, remain in urgent need of medical evacuation. On the 18th of February, the World Bank, the UN, and the EU, in consultation with the Palestinian Authority, released the interim rapid damage and needs assessment report for Gaza and the occupied West Bank. This estimated 53.2 billion is needed over the next decade, primarily for Gaza. On the 30th of January, Israeli legislation that seeks to prevent UNRWA from operating in the territory that Israel regards as being part of the State of Israel, which includes East Jerusalem, came into effect. On 18th of February, Israeli forces and municipality personnel forcefully entered the UNRWA Kalandia training center in East Jerusalem, fired tear gas and sound bombs in its vicinity, and ordered its immediate evacuation, impacting at least 350 students and 30 staff members. Israeli police officers also went to several UNRWA schools in occupied East Jerusalem and ordered their closure. The PA's financial situation remains precarious. On the 12th of January, the Israeli Minister of Finance announced the full repayment of debt it claims was owed by the PA to the Israeli Electric Company by transferring 550 million of the 1.2 billion of Palestinian clearance revenues that Israel has withheld from the PA since October 2023. President Abbas issued a decree on 10th of February cancelling payments by the PA to families of Palestinians killed during or imprisoned following attacks on Israelis. The decree specified that social welfare support based on need will be provided to families through a separate entity. Madam President, in Resolution 2334, the Security Council also called upon all states, and I quote, to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967. End citation. No new steps are known to have been taken in the reporting period. Resolution 2334 also called upon, I quote, all parties to continue inter alia to exert collective efforts to launch credible negotiations on all final status issues in the Middle East peace process, end quote. On 19th of January and 17th of February, the third and fourth meeting of the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution were held in Oslo and Cairo, respectively. The meetings continue to advance efforts towards the implementation of the two-state solution while supporting the ceasefire and hostage release deal. On March 4th, Egypt hosted an emergency summit of the League of Arab States, which endorsed the Arab Islamic Gaza reconstruction plan prepared by Egypt and the Palestinian Authority. Madam President, in closing, allow me to share the Secretary General's observations on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. 1. The Secretary General once again strongly condemns the horrific acts of terror by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups on the 7th of October 2023 and the continued holding of hostages in Gaza. Hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. The Secretary General also condemns the reported ill treatment of hostages, as well as the fact that there are reasonable grounds to believe the hostages may be subjected to sexual violence and abuse. The Secretary General also reiterates his condemnation of Hamas' abhorrent public displays accompanying the release of living and deceased hostages. While in captivity, hostages must be treated humanely and allowed to receive assistance from the International Committee of the Red Cross. 2. The Secretary General again unequivocally condemns the widespread killing and injury of civilians and the destruction of civilian infrastructure in Gaza. Nothing can justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. He mourns UN staff killed in Gaza and strongly condemns the killing of all humanitarian personnel. The Secretary General reiterates his call for the full investigation of all such incidents and accountability for any violations of international law that may have been committed. He also strongly condemns the reported ill treatment, including sexual abuse of Palestinian prisoners and detainees in Israeli detention facilities, and recalls that their release must also be carried out in a dignified manner. He stresses the importance of ensuring the humane treatment of all individuals deprived of their liberty, including freedom from any form of torture and abuse. 3. The Secretary General also condemns indiscriminate attacks and the use of human shields, which are prohibited by international humanitarian law. He urges all parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. 4. The Secretary General reiterates his call for a sustained ceasefire and urges the parties to redouble efforts to end human suffering. He commends the efforts of the mediators, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, to facilitate the implementation of the deal in full, as well as concerted international efforts, including in the region, to support an end to the war and plan for recovery and reconstruction of Gaza. He rejects the forced displacement of the Palestinian population from any part of the occupied Palestinian territory, which would constitute a grave violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. The Secretary General strongly rejects any form of ethnic cleansing. 5. The Secretary General is appalled at the horrific humanitarian situation. Humanitarian aid is not negotiable. While the surge in humanitarian aid has been crucial to saving lives in Gaza, the humanitarian situation remains catastrophic. The UN has proven that with access, the coordinated response can deliver aid people need. The Secretary General strongly condemns the halting of humanitarian assistance into Gaza by Israeli authorities and urges the immediate resumption of humanitarian and commercial deliveries. 6. The escalation of violence in the occupied West Bank is deeply troubling. Alongside the rising death toll, Palestine refugee camps in the northern West Bank are being emptied and are sustaining massive infrastructural damage during Israeli operations. The number of displaced Palestinians continues to rise, and residents continue to be denied the right to return home. The Secretary General is deeply concerned by any long-term presence of Israeli security forces in the camps, which would further undermine the Palestinian Authority and be contrary to Israel's obligation to end its unlawful continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as affirmed by the International Court of Justice. 7. The Secretary General urges security forces to exercise maximum restraint and use lethal force only when it's strictly unavoidable to protect life. He strongly condemns all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror. The Secretary General is alarmed by the lethal attacks carried out by Israeli settlers against Palestinians, including sometimes in the proximity and with the support of the Israeli security forces, as well as by Palestinians against Israelis. All perpetrators must be held accountable. The continued use of heavy weaponry in the occupied West Bank, including in residential areas, is extremely concerning. The Secretary General also recalls that Israel, as the occupying power, has a responsibility to ensure that the civilian population is protected against all acts of violence. The relentless expansion of Israeli settlements, 8, is dramatically altering the landscape and demographics of the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Palestinians are increasingly confined into shrinking and disconnected areas, presenting an existential threat to the prospect of a contiguous, viable, independent Palestinian state. The Secretary General reiterates that settlements have no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation of international law. The demolition and seizure of Palestinian-owned structures entail numerous human rights violations and raise concerns about the risk of forcible transfer. The Secretary General once again urges the government of Israel to abide by its obligation under international law and recall the finding by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion of 19th of July 2024, which declared inter alia that the State of Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. 9. The Secretary General reiterates his call to the parties for the status quo at the holy sites in Jerusalem to be respected and upheld, taking into account the special and historic role of Jordan. 10. The implementation of 2 Knesset laws concerning UNRWA could dramatically hinder efforts to ease human suffering. The Secretary General reiterates there is no alternative to UNRWA. He condemns the breach of the inviolability of the United Nations premises in the occupied Palestinian territory and the attempt to forcibly enter UNRWA schools and to seek their closure. National legislation cannot alter Israel's obligation under international law. 11. The Secretary General welcomes ongoing efforts by regional countries, international partners, and the Palestinian Authority to plan for Gaza's reconstruction, including the Gaza Reconstruction Plan endorsed by and at the Arab League Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The UN will continue to work closely with the Palestinian Authority and all stakeholders to ensure a future for Gaza that provides for protection, recovery, and reconstruction for Palestinians to remain in Gaza, and security for Israel. This will require establishing appropriate security and governance frameworks. Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, must be treated as one, politically, economically, and administratively. 12. We must work collectively to establish a political framework that outlines tangible, irreversible, and time-bound steps. The occupation must end as rapidly as possible. A viable 2-state solution, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace and security, on the basis of United Nations resolutions, previous agreements, and international law, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states, is long overdue. The United Nations will continue to support all efforts towards that goal. End of reading. Thank you.
I thank Special Coordinator Kaag for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Coordinator Sigrid Kaag, for your briefing. As the United States has consistently said, the future of the Middle East must look different. Fresh thinking is needed for a better tomorrow for Israelis and Palestinians alike. The stated purpose of this meeting is to report on the implementation of Resolution 2334, the passage of which was a mistake and whose ongoing discussion is a distraction from the real threats to international peace and security. Indeed, it is an impediment to this Council's work to address them. Hamas bears full responsibility for the ongoing war in Gaza and for the resumption of hostilities. Every death would have been avoided had Hamas accepted the bridge proposal that the United States offered last Wednesday. Hamas continues to hold 59 hostages captive, including 5 Americans. They must be returned to their families immediately. President, colleagues, no country would willingly allow terrorist groups to threaten its people, and Israel is no different. Israel has the right to defend itself from groups that wish to do it harm. As it relates to the West Bank, the United States supports the efforts of the Israel Defense Forces and the Palestinian Authority security forces to root out violent extremists in Jenin and Tulkarem. We welcome the announcement by the Palestinian Authority that it will end the practice of offering cash payments to the families of those who carry out terrorist attacks, which for far too long has incentivized violence against Israeli civilians and set back the prospects of peace. The time for half measures and false promises to end this abhorrent practice has passed. Hamas has steadfastly refused all attempts to extend the ceasefire in recent weeks, including the bridge proposal that would have provided calm beyond Ramadan and Passover and allowed time to negotiate a framework for a permanent ceasefire. President Trump has made clear that Hamas must release the hostages immediately, or there will be hell to pay. That is non-negotiable. The pillars of America's approach remain resolute: stand with Israel and stand for efforts by the IDF to prevent civilian harm. It has been more than 17 months since Hamas started this horrific conflict, upending so many lives and causing such great suffering across the region. The United States calls on the United Nations, and particularly Secretary General Guterres, to join us in putting pressure on Hamas to end the bloodshed and put down its arms. Calls for both sides to respect the ceasefire display a false equivalency that is counterproductive. They fail to acknowledge that Hamas is guilty of rejecting proposals to extend the ceasefire, and they ignore the reality that Hamas must disarm and play no role in the future of Gaza. The United States offers condolences to the family of the UN staffer who was killed on Wednesday in Gaza, and we welcome Israel's investigation into the incident. We also note that far too long, Hamas has misused UN facilities for far too long, and it is important for the UN to speak out about these repeated violations. We expect all parties to comply with international humanitarian law. We recognize Egypt and Qatar's interest in mediating negotiations, and we look forward to continued discussions with Arab partners on the future of Gaza without Hamas. Madam President, we need bold thinking to avoid making the same mistakes in the West Bank, Gaza, and further afield. In 2017, President Trump recognized the reality that Jerusalem is Israel's capital, and several other countries did the same. It is time for new thinking on Gaza as well, so Gazans and the region may enjoy security and prosper. But we must also acknowledge that the Middle East continues to suffer from violence and instability fueled by Iran and the terrorist proxies it funds, such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. The weakening of terrorist groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah provide the countries of the Middle East an opportunity to reshape their region in a way that affords all its people a better path forward. Stronger ties between Israel and its neighbors and an expansion of the Abraham Accords offer an alternative to Iran's malign influence and state sponsorship of terror. We cannot tolerate a nuclear weapons-capable Iran that funds the destruction and destabilizing terrorism plaguing the region and beyond, but the Islamic regime is capable of ending these conflicts. Just as Hamas could end the war today, this moment, by releasing the hostages and laying down its arms, Iran could choose to join the community of nations by ending its support for terrorist proxy groups and providing transparency on its nuclear program that the global community has consistently demanded. The United States will do its part and is committed to working with our Arab partners and Israel to create a brighter future for all of the region's people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias, presidente,
Thank
por
you very
convocar
much,
esta sesión.
President, for convening this
De igual
meeting.
manera, agradecemos a la señora Sigrid
I would
Kaag,
also like to
coordinadora
thank Ms.
especial para el
Sigrid
Medio
Kaag,
Oriente,
Special Coordinator for
por
the
su
Middle
detallado
East,
informe.
for her detailed report.
Reconocemos también la
We
asistencia de
also
los
acknowledge the
representantes de
presence of
Israel,
the representatives
Jordania
of
y
Israel,
el Estado
Jordan,
Observador
and the
de
Observer
Palestina,
State of
que nos
Palestine.
distinguen con su participación esta
They have
mañana.
honored us with their
El
participation this
conflicto
morning.
israelí-palestino
The
es uno de los más
Israeli-Palestinian
prolongados y
conflict is one
dolorosos
of the
de
most
nuestra era,
protracted and
que
painful
ha
of our
cobrado
times.
demasiadas
It has
vidas y
cost
sigue
far too many
desafiando los
lives and
esfuerzos
continues to defy
internacionales
international
por alcanzar
efforts
una paz
to achieve
duradera.
a lasting peace.
Esta semana,
This week,
este Consejo se ha
our
reunido
council
en 3
has met
ocasiones
3
para
times
abordar
to
distintos
address
aspectos de este
different aspects
conflicto
of
y
this
sus
conflict and the
consecuencias.
fallout.
De por sí, un
That
reflejo
in
del
and of
complejo
itself
contexto que
reflects the
enfrentan hoy
complex
las
context
poblaciones en
faced
Cisjordania,
today
Gaza
by
e
the people
Israel.
in the
Y un
West Bank, Gaza,
recordatorio
and
urgente
Israel. It
de
is
que
an
la
urgent
solución a esta
reminder
crisis
that the
no
solution to
puede
this
ser
crisis
militar y
cannot
debe
be
ser
military,
política e
but
integral.
rather must be
Panamá reitera la
comprehensive and
urgente
political.
necesidad de que se ponga
Panama
fin a las
reiterates the urgent
hostilidades,
need to put an
que
end
se
to
libere a
hostilities,
todos los rehenes
to ensure the
incondicionalmente
unconditional
y se
release of
reanude
all
el camino del
hostages
diálogo
and
político
to
que
resume
permita reducir las
dialogue,
diferencias para que se
political
pueda avanzar
dialogue,
hacia un proceso
allowing for
creíble
differences to
con
be
miras a una
overcome
solución perdurable al conflicto.
so that progress
Panamá
towards
reconoce
a credible
que la
process for a
resolución
lasting
2334
solution to the
es
conflict
parte del
can
marco
be
jurídico
ensured. Panama
internacional
recognizes
para
that
la
Resolution
solución de este conflicto.
2334 is part
Al
of the
mismo tiempo,
international legal
comprendemos
framework for the
que
resolution of this
cualquier
conflict.
aplicación
At the
de
same time, we
esta y
understand
otras
that any
resoluciones
implementation of
debe
this and other
considerar siempre
resolutions
las
must
legítimas
always take
preocupaciones de
into account
seguridad
the
de todas
legitimate
las partes
security
involucradas.
concerns of all parties
Señora
involved.
Presidente,
Madam
durante
President,
décadas,
for
la
decades,
falta de voluntad
the lack
política
of
y
political
las
will
decisiones
and
postergadas
deferred
han
decisions
profundizado la
have further
desconfianza
fueled
y
mistrust
generado un
and have
entorno
created
propicio
an
para la
environment
violencia
conducive
que ha
to
sido
violence.
aprovechada por el extremismo.
Extremists have
Si
taken
bien la
advantage of
resolución
these circumstances.
2334
While
se
Resolution
centra en Cisjordania y
2334
Jerusalén
focuses
Oriental,
on the West Bank
sus
and East
principios son
Jerusalem,
igualmente
its
relevantes para
principles
la
are equally
estabilidad en
relevant
otros
for
territorios,
stability in other
como Gaza,
territories, such as
donde
Gaza,
la ausencia
where the
de una
absence
solución
of a
política
political solution
ha facilitado el
has
surgimiento de
facilitated the
fuerzas
rise of
extremistas
extremist
como
forces
Hamas,
such as Hamas.
que ha contribuido a
And this has
prolongar la
contributed
violencia
to
y
prolonging
agravado el
violence and
sufrimiento de las
worsening the
poblaciones
suffering of the
civiles,
civilian population,
impidiendo cada día
every
que se logren
day
avances en la
impeding
resolución de este
progress towards
conflicto.
a resolution of
Panamá
this
confía
conflict.
que en un futuro
Panama trusts
Gaza,
that in a
libre de la
future
autoridad de
Gaza,
grupos
freed from the
extremistas,
rule by
junto con Cisjordania y
extremist groups,
Jerusalén Oriental, puedan
together with
integrarse
the West
plenamente en
Bank
una
and East
estructura territorial y
Jerusalem,
política que permita
can
la
be fully
convivencia
integrated
pacífica
into
entre
a
los pueblos
territorial
de
and
Israel y
political
Palestina
structure, allowing
dentro de
for peaceful
fronteras seguras y
coexistence between the
reconocidas
peoples of Israel and
internacionalmente.
Palestine within
Señora
safe and
Presidente,
internationally recognized
Panamá cree
borders.
firmemente
Madam
que la
President,
convivencia
Panama
pacífica
firmly
es
believes
posible
that peaceful
porque nuestra
coexistence
propia
is possible.
experiencia
Our
lo
own
demuestra.
experience is proof of
En
this.
nuestro país,
In our country,
judíos,
Jews,
cristianos,
Christians,
musulmanes
Muslims,
y otras
and
confesiones
people of other
conviven y
faiths
se relacionan
live
en
side by
armonía y
side and
respeto mutuo.
interact in
Anhelamos
harmony
que esta
and
realidad
mutual respect.
sea la que en
We
el
hope
futuro
that
se
this
viva en
reality
otras
will be the
partes del mundo.
reality in
Por
other
ello,
parts of
Panamá
the world
reitera que
as
solo a
well.
través de una
For
solución
Panama, we
política
believe
negociada
that
será posible
only
alcanzar
through a
una paz
negotiated
justa y
political
duradera
solution will it be
para
possible
israelíes
to
y
achieve a just
palestinos
and lasting
que
peace for
garantice
Israelis
plenamente
and
la seguridad e
Palestinians, fully
integridad de Israel
guaranteeing
y su
the
derecho a vivir
security
en
and
paz.
integrity
Muchas
of Israel
gracias.
and its right to live in peace. Thank
And
you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President.
La France remercie Madame la
France
coordinatrice
thanks the
spéciale pour
special
son rapport.
coordinator for her report.
Le bilan est accablant.
The picture is bleak.
Presque 10 ans après la
Almost 10 years
résolution
after the adoption of
2334,
Resolution 2334,
résolution de référence,
that is a
résolution canonique
benchmark
à nos yeux.
resolution,
Tout ou presque s'est
a
dégradé
landmark
et la région
resolution
vit une
in our
catastrophe qui
view.
semble ne pas vouloir finir.
Everything or almost everything, has
Notre
worsened
Conseil a eu
in the
l'occasion
region
de
and the
discuter de
catastrophe
cette
seems
situation
to know
hier et
no
avant-hier
end.
déjà,
Our council has had an
ou
opportunity to
plutôt deux de
discuss
ces dimensions les plus
this
tragiques.
situation
Le
yesterday
sort
and the day
poignant
before
des otages
yesterday. At
israéliens,
least we've
retenus
discussed
par
two
le
of the
Hamas depuis le
dimensions,
7
the most
octobre
tragic ones,
2023,
the harrowing
le
fate
sort
of the
tragique
Israeli
de la population
hostages
de
held by
Gaza
Hamas since the
depuis
7th
le
of
début de
October
l'offensive militaire
2023,
israélienne.
and the fate of the people
La
of
position de
Gaza
la France
since
est
the
bien
beginning
connue et
of
je
the
la rappelle
Israeli
en quelques
military
mots.
offensive.
Rien ne peut justifier les
France's
attentats
position is
terroristes
well
commis
known,
par
and
le
I will
Hamas
sum
le
it
7
up here in a
octobre.
few words.
La
Nothing
France
can
les condamne
justify the
absolument.
terrorist attacks committed on
Comme
the
l'a dit le
7th of
président Macron à
October.
maintes reprises,
France
Israël
condemns them
a le droit de se
absolutely.
défendre,
As
mais dans le respect
President
du droit
Macron has
international
said on a number of
humanitaire
occasions,
et en
Israel
ayant
has the right to
conscience qu'il
self-defense,
n'y a
but
pas de
with respect
solution
for
militaire à Gaza.
IHL and aware of the fact that there is no
L'accord de
military
janvier a
solution in
ouvert une
Gaza. The
perspective avec ses
January
trois phases
agreement provided
et son
a prospect
articulation
with
entre le
its three
cessez-le-feu,
phases,
la libération de tous les otages,
including
la
the
reprise de l'aide
ceasefire, the
humanitaire
release of all
et l'engagement
hostages, the
d'une
resumption
discussion
of
sur l'avenir.
humanitarian aid, and
42
commitment
jours
to a
ont porté
future,
la promesse
to
d'un
a discussion
changement.
about the future.
Depuis la reprise du blocus de l'aide humanitaire par Israël et le
42
lancement
days
d'une nouvelle
where
campagne de
we held this
bombardement
promise
massif,
for change,
à
since the
nouveau,
resumption
la
of the
terreur
blockade
et la
on
mort règnent sur
humanitarian aid
Gaza.
by Israel and the
La
beginning
raison
of a new
invoquée par
campaign
Israël
of
pour
massive
justifier son
shelling, once
revirement ne
again,
tient pas.
terror and
Les
death
retards
reign
dans la
in
libération
Gaza.
des otages ne sauraient
The reason
justifier
invoked by
la
Israel to
punition de tout un
justify this does not hold
Voilà
water,
pourquoi
and
nous appelons à
delays in the
nouveau
release of
à la
hostages cannot
libération de
justify the
toutes et
punishment of
tous
an
les
entire
otages
people.
dans la dignité
We call,
et à la
therefore, once
restitution des
again
corps
for
des
the release of
décédés.
all hostages
Le
in
Hamas
dignity
doit
and
le
the
faire
return of
et
the
épargner au monde la
bodies of the
sinistre mise en
deceased.
scène à laquelle il soumet
Hamas
les otages libérés. Qui
must
gagne-t-il
spare the world from
Sinon
this
de
very
manifester de
dark,
façon
bleak
spectaculaire
picture,
son mépris pour la vie.
and the
Voilà
situation
pourquoi nous
it
appelons
has
le gouvernement
subjected the
israélien à
unfortunate
reprendre sans condition l'aide humanitaire, à
hostages
cesser les
to,
bombardements,
who
à s'en tenir à la
wins
logique des négociations,
in
quelque
this
lente qu'elle
situation
soit, en cessant de répondre
by
à la
showing such
cruauté
contempt
par
for
le
life.
déchaînement de la violence.
We call on
Pour
the
notre
Israeli
part,
government
nous nous tenons aux
to
côtés des
resume
pays
without
qui,
condition humanitarian aid, to
États-Unis,
cease shelling, and to
Qatar,
hold to the negotiations,
Égypte,
however slow they are,
travaillent
and
inlassablement à
to stop
obtenir du
responding
Hamas
to
la
cruelty
reprise
by
des
unleashing
libérations
violence. For our
et
part,
du
we
gouvernement
stand side
israélien
by
le
side
retour
with
à la
the
logique
US,
de leur janvier.
Qatar, and Egypt, working
Mais Madame la
tirelessly to
Présidente, le
obtain from
Conseil ne
Hamas the
doit pas
release of the
détourner les yeux de
hostages,
l'autre
and
réalité
calling upon
que
Israel to
signale le
return
rapport
to
du
the
secrétaire
process from
général
January.
et
But,
que
Madam
nous
President,
rapporte
the
Madame
Council must not
Sivicad
turn a
en
blind eye
application de
to
la
the other
résolution
reality
2334.
pointed out in Ms. Cog's
Relire le
report,
texte de cette
pursuant to
résolution
Resolution
et
2334.
précisément ses
In
paragraphes
rereading the text,
opérationnels
more
au regard de
specifically the
la politique
operational
israélienne
paragraphs with
actuelle,
regard to the
c'est
current
mesurer à
Israeli
quel point
policies,
nous sommes loin du compte.
in doing that, we
La
see how far
colonisation à
off the mark
Jérusalem-Est
we
et en
are.
Cisjordanie ne
Settlements
s'arrête
in
pas.
East Jerusalem and
Elle
in the West Bank
s'intensifie
are ongoing.
et
They are
devient de
being
plus en
ramped
plus
up and they are
violente.
becoming
Elle se
increasingly
produit
violent, and
avec
they
la
are taking
participation
place with the
active des
active
forces de sécurité
participation of the
israéliennes.
Israeli security
Le
forces.
droit est là,
We have the
réaffirmé par
law.
la Cour
It has been
internationale de
reaffirmed by the
justice dans son arrêt
ICJ
consultatif
in
du
its
19 juillet
advisory
dernier.
opinion on the 19th of
Israël
July.
doit cesser
Israel must
toute activité
cease
de
all
colonisation dans les
settlement
territoires
activity
occupés,
in the occupied
car elle est
territories
illégale.
because it is illegal.
Puissance occupante,
An occupying
Israël a le
power,
devoir
Israel
d'empêcher les
has the
violences
right
commises par les
or the
colons
duty
extrémistes
to halt
et de
violence
protéger les civils
carried out by
palestiniens,
extremist
de
settlers and to
préserver le
protect
statu quo
Palestinian
historique sur les
civilians,
lieux
to
saints,
preserve
en
the
un mot,
historic status
d'empêcher
quo
tout
over
ce
the
qui
holy
rapproche de
sites.
l'annexion de
In
fait
short,
des
to
territoires palestiniens
halt
occupés.
anything that
Le ministre
relates
Jean-Noël
to
Barrot
de
l'a dit
facto
aujourd'hui,
annexation
la
of the
France est
occupied
tout opposée à
Palestinian
toute forme
territories.
d'annexion, qu'elle
Minister
concerne la
Barrot
Cisjordanie ou
said
Gaza.
this today. France is opposed
Le
to
droit
any form of
l'exige,
annexation,
mais
be it
aussi la
in the
raison
West Bank or in
politique.
Gaza.
La spirale de violence qui s'est mise en mouvement depuis le 7
The law
octobre,
requires it, but
culmination
so does
d'une dégradation
political logic.
progressive
The
ces
spiral
dernières
of
années, ne fait
violence,
pas que détruire
which has been
et
set in
tuer des
motion
civils
since the
innocents.
7th of
Elle
October,
nourrit
is the
la haine
culmination of a
de part et
progressive
d'autre.
worsening over
Elle
the
éloigne
past
de
few
toute
years.
perspective de paix.
It has simply
Qui peut
destroyed
raisonnablement penser qu'une
the
solution
lives of
consentie émergera de
innocent
ce
civilians.
cauchemar?
It is
Qui
fueling
peut penser
hatred
qu'une
on
solution
all sides,
négociée
and it
entre
is taking us
Israéliens et
further away from
Palestiniens
the
peut
prospects of peace?
aboutir
Who
quand
can
les esprits
reasonably
sont
think that
prisonniers de ce
an
cycle
agreed
de
solution will
violence?
emerge
C'est
from this
cette logique d'escalade et de déni de
nightmare? Who
l'autre
can
qu'il
believe
faut.
that a negotiated
Pour
solution
cette
between
raison, depuis
Israelis
des
and
mois, la
Palestinians
France travaille avec tous les
can
pays,
be
arabes en premier lieu,
brought about
à la recherche d'un
if their
mécanisme qui,
minds are
s'appuyant
still
sur sur le point de
prisoners of this
départ
cycle of
d'un
violence. For
cessez-le-feu
that
dans les
reason,
termes
for
de
months, France
janvier
has been working with all
réengagera le
countries,
dialogue.
the Arab countries
La
first and
conférence
foremost, to
internationale sur la
find
solution
a
à deux États
mechanism
a été
and to
demandée par
use the
l'Assemblée générale le
ceasefire
3 décembre
pursuant
à
to
une
the
écrasante
January terms
majorité.
as a starting point for
Avec l'Arabie
resuming dialogue.
saoudite,
The
la France travaille
International
activement à sa
Two-State Solution
préparation.
Conference
En
called
même
for
temps,
by the General
nous
Assembly
fondons
on
nos
the 3rd
espoirs sur la conférence de
December was done
reconstruction
so
de
by an
Gaza que
overwhelming
prépare
majority,
l'Égypte
with Saudi
avec la
Arabia,
Ligue
France
arabe.
is working actively
Enfin,
to
Madame
prepare
la
for it.
Présidente, Il est du devoir de
And
notre
we
Conseil
do hope,
de
place a great deal of
réaffirmer
hope
avec
in the conference for
force
the
que
reconstruction
l'ONU,
of Gaza, which has
notre
been
maison
prepared by
commune,
Egypt
doit
and the
être
Arab League.
respectée.
Finally, Madam, it is
La
our
France
duty
exprime sa
as the Council to
consternation à
reaffirm
la suite des frappes
that
qui ont touché des bâtiments
the
de l'ONU.
agreements must be respected.
L'attaque a fait plusieurs
France
victimes,
is
dont un
quite
mort.
concerned that
2 ressortissants
two French
français employés
citizens
des Nations
employed by the
Unies
United
ont
Nations
été
were
grièvement
seriously
blessés.
wounded
La
following
France
the
présente ses
strikes.
condoléances à l'ONU,
And we extend
aux
our
victimes
condolences to the
et à
UN,
leurs
to our
familles.
victims, and to
Elle
their
rappelle que les
families, and it
installations
recalls
et personnels
that
de l'ONU
the
doivent
facilities
être
and
absolument
personnel of
protégés
the
contre les
UN must
attaques.
absolutely
En
be
outre,
protected
la
against
France appelle à
attacks.
ce que
Moreover,
cessent
France
les
calls
accusations
for a
infondées
cessation
selon
of
lesquelles
baseless
l'ONU, ses
allegations
organisations et
according
ses
to which
agences
the United
n'accompliraient
Nations,
pas
its
leur mission de
organizations and
protection des
agencies
plus
are not
vulnérables,
carrying out their
de
mission to protect the
réaffirmation de
most
droits,
vulnerable, to
de secours aux victimes,
reaffirm
de
law,
condamnation des
to
actes de
provide
terrorisme
relief to
ou
victims,
des
to
violations
condemn
du droit
acts of
humanitaire.
terrorism or
L'ONU
violations of
remplit sa
human
mission,
rights.
ses
The
personnels
UN
le
is
font du
carrying
mieux
out
qu'ils
its
peuvent,
mission.
trop
The
souvent au
staff are
prix de leur
doing
vie.
what they can,
Faisons en
quite
sorte
often
que
at the
toutes ces
cost of
victimes
their own
sacrifiées,
lives. Let us make sure that these
israéliennes,
sacrificed victims,
palestiniennes,
Israelis, Palestinians,
onusiennes,
and
ne l'aient
UN
pas été en
workers
vain. Je
will
vous
not have
remercie.
been in vain. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
谢谢主席女士，
Thank you, Madam President.
我感谢卡
I
格临
thank
时特别
Special
协调员
Coordinator
的通
Clark
报，
for her briefing.
并愿通过你对
I'd
联合
like
国秘
to
书长古特雷斯
Comment through you
在巴以问
the
题上的立
position
场
of the
表
UN
示
Secretary
赞赏。
General Antonio Guterres on the Palestinian-Israeli issue.
加沙战火再
The
起，
resumed
引起国
fighting
际
in
社会
Gaza
广
has
泛
sparked
关切和担忧
widespread。concern and apprehension
以
in
色
the
列
international
从
community.
3月17
Since
日
17th
开
March,
始实施大规
Israel
模
has
空袭，
carried out large-scale
重新发
airstrikes,
动地面进
renewed
攻，
its ground
并占领
offensive,
加
and
沙中部。
occupied central Gaza.
以色列还先后
Israel
切断
has also
人道
cut
物
off
资准
access
入
to
和电
humanitarian
力供应，
supplies and electricity
造
in
成巨大
succession,
人员伤亡，
causing massive loss
使
of
人道
lives
灾难更加严峻。
and worsening the
中
already
方
grave
对来之不
humanitarian
易的停
disaster.
火被打破
China
表
is
示
gravely
严重关
concerned
切。
about the breakdown of the Hot-1 ceasefire.
15个月血
The
腥冲
stark
突和
contrast
42天
between the
停火的鲜明
15-month-long
对
bloody
比，已
conflict
经说明
and the 42-day
重启
ceasefire
战事
speaks
不
volumes.
是解决
Resuming
人
the
质的
fighting
正
is
确
not the
方
right
式，
way to bring back
只会
hostages.
造成
It
更
only
多的
results
杀
in
戮。
more killings.
实现持久停
Securing
火
a
是拯
durable
救生命
ceasefire、
让人质
is
回
the
家的
best way
最好办
to
法，
save lives and bring
是压倒一
hostages
切的
home,
优
and
先事项。
it is an overriding priority.
我们敦促以色列
We urge Israel
放弃使
to
用武力
abandon
的执念
its，obsession
立
with the
即
use
停
of
止
force,
对加沙的
immediately
军事
cease
行动，
its military operations against
解
Gaza,
除
and lift
对人道物资
blockade
进入加沙的封锁。
on the access of humanitarian supplies to
希
Gaza.
望停火
It is
协议
hoped
的保
that the
障国
guarantors of the
秉持
ceasefire
公
agreement
正、
will
负
act
责任态度，
impartially and
采取
responsibly
行动，
to
推
promote
动3阶段
consistent
停火协议
implementation of the
连
three-phase
贯落实，
ceasefire
在加
agreement
沙实现
in order
持
to
久停
achieve
火。
a durable ceasefire in Gaza.
在加沙燃烧的同
With
时，
Gaza
约
in
旦和
flames of
西岸
war, the
局
situation
势
in the
同
West
样
Bank
危急
is。equally critical.
过去1年多，
Over the
以
past
色
year
列
or so,
在
Israel
西岸
has
大
been
规模扩
expanding
张定居
its
点，
settlements in the
拆
West
除
Bank
大量巴
on
勒
a
斯坦
massive
人民
scale,
房屋，
demolishing a large number of
纵容
Palestinian
定
homes
居者暴
and
力。
condoning settler
特别
violence.
是在过
In
去2个
particular,
月，
over the past 2
以色列
months,
持续开展
continued
军事
Israeli
行动，
military operations have emptied
强制
by
清空
force
多个巴勒
multiple
斯坦难
refugee
民营，
camps,
造成4万多
displacing
人流离
over
失所。
40,000 people.
定居点活动
Settlement
违反国际
activities
法和安
violate
理会第
international law and
2334号决
Council
议。
Resolution
以色列
2334.
应当
Israel
停止
should
对西
cease
岸的袭击，
its attacks on the West
停
Bank,
止定
stop
居点活动，
settler
切实
activities,
遏制定
and
居者暴
effectively
力。
curb settler violence.
中方重申，
China wishes to
落实
reiterate
两国方
that
案是解
implementing
决
the
巴勒
two-state
斯坦问题
solution
的唯一
is
可
the
行
only
途径。
viable way to resolve the
国际社
Palestinian
会
issue.
应当加大努
The
力，
international community
推
should
进
step
两
up
国
its
方案
efforts to
政治进
promote
程，
political process of
并
the
为
two-state
此提
solution
供有力
and
保障。
provided with robust
中方
guarantees.
支持
China
埃及
supports
和阿拉伯国家共
the
同发起
Gaza
的加
recovery
沙
and
恢复
reconstruction
和
plan
重建
jointly
计划，
initiated by Egypt and
支
other Arab
持
states
以
and supports
8人治8原
the
则开
commencement
启
of
重建，
rebuilding in accordance with with the principal Palestinians governing
中国反
Palestine.
对
China
对
opposes
加沙民众的强制
a
迁
forced
移，
removal of
反对
Palestinian
任何
people.
吞并加
We
沙
oppose
或西岸
any
领土的
attempt
企
to
图。
annex the West Bank and Gaza and other
Sushi.
territories.
在中东其他地区，
President,
紧张局势
elsewhere
也在
in the
升级
Middle East,
和
tensions
平
are also
稳定
rising.
仍受
Peace
到威
and
胁。
stability are still in peril.
以色列军队
Israeli
占领
forces
黎巴嫩
have
南部
occupied
5处地点，
5
违
locations
反
in
安理
southern
会第
Lebanon,
1701
flouting
号
Council
决
Resolution
议，
1701,
侵犯黎巴嫩主
violating
权和领
Lebanese
土完整。
sovereignty and territorial
以
integrity.
色列近期
Israel's
频繁
recent
对叙
frequent
利亚
airstrikes
发
against
动
Syria
空袭，同样侵
have
犯
also violated
叙利亚主权
Syria's
和领土完整。
sovereignty and territorial integrity.
中方敦促以色列尽
China
快
urges
从黎
Israel
巴
to
嫩、叙利亚
withdraw
领土撤
from
出。
Syria and Lebanon
叙利亚政治
without
过渡
delay.
正处于
The
关键阶
political
段。
transition
叙
in
利亚
Syria is
临
at
时
a
当局
critical
有
stage.
责任
The Syrian
确保
authorities
政
are
治进程
responsible
的包
for
容性，
ensuring the
并切实履
inclusiveness of
行
the political
根据
process
国
and
际法
effective
承担的义
fulfillment
务，
of their
包
obligations
括
under
反恐
international
方
law,
面的义务。
including counterterrorism obligations.
中方对也门和红海局势再次
China
升级表示关切，
expresses concern over the
呼吁
renewed
有关国
escalation
家
in Yemen
停
and
止
Red
对
Sea
也门的
and
空
calls on
袭，
the country
切
concerned to
实
stop
尊
their
重也
airstrikes
门主
against
权
Yemen
安全
and
和
respect
领
in
土完
earnest
整。
Yemen's sovereignty, security, and territorial
不再武
integrity.
装，
The
应当
Houthis
停止
should
针
stop
对
any
商船
attacks
的任
against
何
and
袭
harassment
扰行
of
为，
commercial
维
vessels
护
and
红海水
maintain
域航
safe
道安
routes
全。
of navigation in the Red Sea.
伊朗核问题
The
再
Iranian
次
nuclear
走
issue
到
has
关
once
键
again
时刻
come
路
to a
口，
critical crossroads.
妥善处
A
理伊
proper
朗核问
handling
题
of the
对于
Iranian
中东
nuclear
地
issue
区和平
is
稳定
crucial
至关
to
重要。
peace and stability in the Middle
历
East.
史和现实
History
反
and
复证
reality
明，
have once again,
制裁、
time and again,
制裁施
proven
压、
the
武力
futility
威
of
胁没
sanction,
有出路。
pressure, and the
对
threat
话
of
协
force.
商才是
Only
真正
dialogue
的
and
解决之道。
consultation provides the right way
3月
forward.
14日，
March
伊
the
朗核问
14th
题
saw a
中俄
successful
伊
Beijing
北京
meeting
会
between
晤
China,
成功举
Russia,
行，
and
并发
Iran
表联
on
合
the
声明。
Iranian nuclear issue. A joint statement
王
was
毅外长
issued
在会
from
见
Minister
俄罗
Wang
斯
He
伊朗
during
与会
his
代表
meeting with
时，
the representatives
就
of
新形
Russia
势
and
下
Iran,
妥善
put
解
forward
决伊朗
China's
核问
5-point
题，
proposition
提出中
on
方
the
无
proper
减主
settlement
张，
of the Iranian nuclear issue in the new context.
呼吁坚持
Calling
通过
for
政治外交手
adherence
段
to
和平
peaceful
解决争
settlement of
端，
disputes through political and
呼吁
diplomatic
积
means,
极为
the
恢复对话
creation
谈判
of
创造
conditions
条件，
for the resumption of
避
dialogue,
免采取
negotiation,
升
and
级
cautioning
升
against
级
any
局势的
action
举动。
that may escalate the situation.
中方愿同各
China
方一
stood
道，
ready
努
to
力
work
推
with all
动达
parties
成
for a just,
公正、平
balanced,
衡、
and
可持续
sustainable
的
solution to
伊
the
朗核
Iranian
问题
nuclear
解决
issue.
方案，维护国际核
Uphold
不扩散
the
机制，
international nuclear
促进
non-proliferation
国际
regime
和地区
and
和平
promote
稳定。
international and regional peace and stability.
最后，我要
In
重申，
conclusion, I wish to
巴勒斯坦
reiterate
问
that
题是
Palestine
中东问题
issue,
的核
the
心。
question of Palestine, is at the core of the Middle East problem.
加沙不能
Gaza
成为政治
must
博
not
弈的战场，
become a battleground for
平
political
民生
gain.
命不能
Civilian
成
lives
为
must not
政
be
治算计
sacrificed
的牺牲
to
品。
political calculations.
加沙必须实
A
现持久
durable
停火。
ceasefire must be realized in
中
Gaza.
方支持
A
安理
lasting
会
ceasefire
为此采
must
取
be
一
realized
切
in
必要
Gaza.
行动。
China
谢谢
supports
主席。
all necessary action by the Council to this end. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. And before giving the floor to the representative of Pakistan, as I understand that this is his last meeting in the Security Council, allow me to pay tribute to our dear colleague, Ambassador Munir Akram, on the completion of his tenure as permanent representative of Pakistan to the United Nations. I know I speak for all our colleagues when I say when we thank you for your cooperation and your dedication to the work of the Security Council and the United Nations. We'll all wish you wisdom, miss your wisdom, your wit, and your warmth. So we wish you the very best in your future endeavors. And you have the floor, Munir.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for those kind words. I hope they enjoy consensus in the Council. Madam President, Pakistan thanks Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her comprehensive briefing, and we endorse the Secretary General's conclusions and recommendations as conveyed by the Special Coordinator in her presentation. We are meeting again, Madam President, to review the consequences of what we all know and understand is a process of ethnic cleansing. And as the ICJ has said, I quote, probable genocide. More than 50,000 innocent Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed in Gaza, over 100,000 injured. And since Israel broke the Gaza ceasefire on Tuesday, 591 Palestinians, including 200 children, have been killed and 1,042 injured in the Gaza Strip. Pakistan strongly condemns Israel's latest escalation, including its renewed bombardment of Gaza and its systematic blockage of humanitarian assistance, as well as the decision to cut off power supply that threatens water access in the Palestinian territories. Over 90,000 of Gaza's population faces starvation due to Israel's blockade. Newborn babies are reportedly dying. Civilian structures, hospitals, schools, and mosques are being destroyed on the pretext of targeting combatants. Every principle of international law, including international humanitarian law, has been violated. But Israel has vowed to continue the slaughter irrespective of its consequences for Palestinian civilians. It is doing so with impunity, knowing well that the world and this Council will be deterred from taking any action to enforce its resolutions calling for a ceasefire and an end to the mounting atrocities. Madam President, the Gaza genocide is now being extended to the West Bank. Israel's large-scale military operations, which began in Jenin and other areas of the northern West Bank on 21st January, have expanded to Nur Shams, Tulkaram, and Jenin camps, causing the largest population displacement since 1967. Daily military raids, settler violence, and illegal land annexations are part of a systematic effort to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian people in the West Bank. According to OCHA, between 7 October 2023 and 4 March 2025, 896 Palestinians, including children and women, were killed in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. 90 Palestinians since the start of this year. The ongoing expansion of illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem flagrantly violate the international law and UN Security Council Resolution 2334 and constitutes a clear breach of the Charter. Security Council resolutions are binding, Madam President, and cannot be ignored or selectively observed. The Security Council and the world community cannot sit back and watch this ongoing ethnic cleansing. A failure to halt this brutal war will unleash the worst instincts of powerful and predatory states, shred the principles of the UN Charter designed to prevent aggression and the scourge of war, and create a Hobbesian hell of conflict and chaos. Madam President, the elected members of this Security Council, who have a direct mandate from the General Assembly to work for peace and security and the defense of the Charter, must again come forward to initiate concrete measures to end this cruel war and restore the conditions for a durable peace in the Middle East. The Palestine issue is the heart of all the conflicts that are raging in the Middle East. To address the Palestine question, the Council can and must take the following decisions. First, we must demand that Israel immediately halt its military attacks in Gaza and its military operations and the settler violence on the West Bank, and that an indefinite and continuous ceasefire be established. 2, the Israeli blockade of humanitarian supplies to Gaza must be ended and full access provided to the UN and other humanitarian agencies and organizations. Starvation of civilians cannot be used as a weapon of war. 3, negotiations should be resumed to implement the second and third phases of the ceasefire agreement of 12 January, including for the release of hostages and withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. The ceasefire should be observed until these negotiations are concluded on the second and third phase of the agreement, as also envisaged in Resolution 2735. We would hope that the mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, will work to secure the full potential of the 12 January agreement. 4, serious and high-level consideration should be accorded by all major partners to the Arab and OIC plan for recovery and reconstruction of Gaza. This plan offers a practical and realistic path for economic and social rehabilitation in Gaza, for its governance, and for peace between the Palestinians and Israel. 5, simultaneously, a credible and irreversible political process must be launched to promote the two-state solution, including the establishment of an independent and sovereign Palestinian state within the pre-June 1967 borders, with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. Madam President, if we can agree to initiate these steps, particularly if we can halt Israel's military campaign, sustain a ceasefire, and end the humanitarian crisis, it would create conditions conducive to the success of the endeavor for a two-state solution at the conference co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and France next June. This is an outcome that should be desired by the world and should enjoy consensus within the Security Council. I thank you, Madam President.
And I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag for her briefing today. We share the grief for the UNOP staff member who died these past days and express our sincere condolences to his families and the UN. We hope for the speedy recovery of the other 5 UN personnel who were seriously injured. Madam President, the world craves for peace in Gaza. This is the main takeaway for our discussion this week. Israelis deserve peace. Palestinians deserve peace. The ceasefire and hostage release agreement in Gaza demonstrated during a short but crucial lifespan that progress is possible when the parties are bold enough to commit to it. The flow of humanitarian aid was greatly improved, and Israel also allowed the return of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to northern Gaza, while the guns were widely silenced. However, the resumption of hostilities and the alarming death toll on civilians that has ensued is cause for grave concern. Greece has repeatedly condemned the October 7 terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas, as well as the ongoing detention and cruel and inhumane treatment of its hostages. We reiterate our demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and unequivocally condemning Hamas's terror. It is the people of Gaza that suffer in the face of Hamas intransigence and Israeli launch of operation. We echo the calls for the crossings to open as soon as possible and for humanitarian aid to flow again at scale and unhindered in Gaza. The suffering of civilians must end. At this critical juncture, we call for the immediate and full implementation of the ceasefire agreement. In the meantime, we urge for the unconditional, massive, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid at scale and the restoration of access to electricity and water. While the unhindered and continuous flow of aid into all parts of Gaza should remain a priority, UNRWA's role still remains pivotal and indispensable. Madam President, Greece is a staunch proponent of international law which frames and guides its foreign policy. In line with its principles, we call for the respect of the 4th Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in times of war in 1949. We recall that, as outlined in Security Council Resolution 2334, acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible by international law. We deplore the increase of settlement activity in the West Bank. Such attempts are contrary to international law, and the relevant Security Council resolution have no legal validity. The cessation of settlement activity is essential for salvaging the two-state solution. We are particularly concerned about the reported escalation of violence in the West Bank and the displacement of some 40,000 people, particularly from refugee camps in the north. Attacks on civilians, including children, as well as on civilian infrastructure, constitute violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law. The reported demolition and seizure of Palestine-owned structure is also concerning. As this is a Muslim holy month of Ramadan, soon to be followed by Easter for all Christian denominations, we are reminded of the importance of the special status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem. Considering the universal importance of the holy sites, Greece reaffirms its deep interest in the preservation of the status quo. Madame la Présidente, I will switch in French now.
Madam President,
Pour n'importe quel parti,
for
choisir
any
l'escalade
party
serait
opting for
dangereux,
escalation would be
surtout dans
dangerous,
cette région
especially
instable.
in this unstable
Alors que le
region.
Liban tente de se
Lebanon
relever
is now
et que la
trying to
situation
recover, and the
sécuritaire en
security
Syrie demeure
situation in
volatile,
Syria
la
remains
stabilité
volatile,
régionale semble
and therefore
précaire.
the stability
Dans ce
regionally
contexte,
remains
les
precarious.
efforts
In this
louables des
context, the
États-Unis,
laudable
de
efforts by
l'Égypte et
the
du
United
Qatar
States,
pour amener
Egypt,
les
and
parties à la
Qatar to
table de
bring parties to
négociation
the
doivent
negotiating
être
table
couronnés de succès.
must be
Le
successful.
processus
The
politique
political
doit
process
être
has to be
revitalisé afin de
revitalized so as
parvenir à une
to get
solution à
to
deux
the
États,
two-state
conformément aux
solution in
résolutions
line
pertinentes
with
du
the
Conseil
relevant
de
resolution
sécurité,
of the Security
tout en
Council,
reconnaissant le
while
droit d'Israël à
recognizing
exister en
the
paix et en
right of
sécurité.
Israel to exist in peace and security.
Nous attendons donc
We
avec
are
beaucoup
looking
d'intérêt la
forward,
conférence
therefore, with a
internationale
great
qui
deal
se
of interest
tiendra
to
à
the
New York
international
cet été
conference
sur
in
la
New York
coprésidence de la
this
France
summer
et
to be
d'Arabie
co-chaired
saoudite.
by France and
Dans
Saudi
le même
Arabia.
esprit,
In the same
le plan
spirit,
arabe
the
pour la
Arab plan
récupération et
for
la
the
reconstruction
recovery
de
and
Gaza,
reconstruction
présenté par
in Gaza,
l'Égypte, est une
presented by
proposition
Egypt,
constructive
is a constructive
et la
proposal,
Grèce se réjouit de
and Greece
participer au
is happy
développement de
to
telles
participate
activités,
in the
entre
development of such
autres dans le
activities
cadre de la
inter
prochaine
alia within
conférence
the framework of the
internationale
upcoming
sur la
international
reconstruction
conference
qui se tiendra
on
au Caire ce
reconstruction
printemps.
to take place in
Madame la
Cairo in the
Présidente,
spring.
une
Madam
autorité
President, a Palestinian
palestinienne
authority
renforcée,
which is
réformée,
strengthened and
capable
reformed,
d'exercer sa
capable
gouvernance
of
effective en
effectively governing
Cisjordanie,
in the West Bank and
éventuellement à
eventually
Gaza,
in Gaza,
doit être au cœur
has
de
to
nos
be
efforts
at
pour
the
l'après-guerre.
heart of our post-war
Pour les
efforts.
otages israéliens
For the
et pour
Israeli
le peuple
hostages and for the
palestinien
Palestinian
qui
people
espèrent tous
who
rentrer chez
all
eux
want
sains et
to go
saufs,
home
il
safe
faut
and
que nous
sound,
redoublions nos efforts
we
pour
need
la
to
paix,
redouble our efforts for
que nous
peace.
replacions
We
le
need to
désespoir par
replace
l'espoir,
their
tout en luttant
desperation with
contre la
hope,
cause profonde de la
while combating the
radicalisation,
root
car
causes
l'espoir
of
peut renaître
radicalization.
à condition
Because
que nous
hope
ayons le
can
courage
rise again if
d'emprunter
we
le
have the
chemin de la paix.
courage to take
Je
the
vous
road of
remercie.
peace. I thank you.
Representative of Greece for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. And I also want to thank Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her briefing. Colleagues, upon receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin stated, and I quote, "There is only one radical means for sanctifying human life. The one radical solution is a real peace." End of quote. His words remain as valid today as they were back then. Madam President, we have been witnessing what many are calling the Gazification of the West Bank, in particular through Operation Iron Wall. This campaign has led to the most extensive destruction and displacement in the West Bank since 1967. Looking at the pictures of destruction in the northern West Bank, one might think it was taken in Gaza. Military operations, particularly in Jenin and in other refugee camps, are deeply disturbing. We condemned killings of civilians, including children, and recently a pregnant woman. We call on the Israeli government to hold these large-scale military operations, as well as the pattern of unlawful use of force against civilians, destruction and demolitions. Not only sites, also dynamics remind us of Gaza. Violence is spreading like fire. Forced displacement is unfolding, and humanitarian crisis advancing across the West Bank. This is intertwined with increased checkpoints and movement restrictions, fragmenting Palestinian communities and restricting access to essential services, and coupled with settler violence in this context. The one radical solution is a real peace. Madam President, we underline Slovenia's support to the ceasefire agreement in Gaza, in line with the Council Resolution 2735. We note with great concern that rather than moving towards the next phases of its implementation, the situation has deteriorated by spillover of violence from Gaza to the West Bank and by a rise of limitations. Limitations to the work of UNRWA, limitations to the Palestinian Authority, limitations to the political process and viability of two-state solution, limitations to the work of non-governmental organizations, limitations to civic space, including free speech, as observed through the raids of the educational bookshop. We are deeply alarmed by the overall patterns observed in the West Bank, Israel, and more broadly, in the trajectory of Israel-Palestine question. We once again underline our steadfast rejection of annexation and of deportation of Palestinians, and call for the end of the occupation and return of displaced persons to their homes. As is the case with all Council resolutions, Resolution 2334 is legally binding and must be implemented. The one radical solution is a real peace. Finally, Madam President, we echo High Commissioner Sturk's words that any plan for a better future must deal with the past, so accountability is crucial. Killings must be investigated and perpetrators held to account. We would appreciate being briefed one day on the progress of investigations of numerous crimes committed in Gaza against civilians and humanitarian staff. The same goes for all human rights violations and abuses that have taken place in Gaza and Israel. Pages of history already written, including those contained in the reports of accountability mechanisms, such as More Than a Human Can Bear report by the Commission of Inquiry, must be a wake-up call for a new chapter to take place, a radical future, the one of a real peace for Israelis and the Palestinians alike. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Coordinator Karg for her briefing. We welcome this opportunity to discuss the evolving situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. And first, I'll address recent developments in Gaza. This week saw more bloodshed return to the Gaza Strip. It is appalling that hundreds of Palestinians have been killed following Israeli strikes since the 18th of March. We strongly oppose Israel's resumption of hostilities. Escalation and endless violence is in nobody's interests. We are outraged that a UN compound in Gaza was hit on Wednesday morning. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families. There must be a full investigation into what happened. We urge all parties to return to dialogue and to implement the ceasefire agreement in full. This must include the return of the 59 hostages who've been cruelly held by Hamas for over 500 days. As we said in the Council yesterday, Hamas must be held accountable for their depraved actions. We also call on Israel to immediately restore humanitarian access and electricity to Gaza. Refusing to do so risks breaching international humanitarian law. Second, President, we must look to the future and redouble our efforts to secure long-term peace for Israelis and Palestinians. This means a credible plan to allow Palestinians in Gaza to return home and rebuild their lives, with Hamas removed from power. To be clear, we oppose any attempt to forcibly annex land in Gaza. We welcome the Arab initiative of a recovery and reconstruction plan for Gaza, and we urge all parties to engage constructively with it. Sustainable peace also means addressing worrying developments in the West Bank. We are seriously concerned by the scale of the Israeli military operation in the West Bank and the displacement of nearly 40,000 Palestinian refugees. We recognize Israel's right to self-defense, but civilians must be protected, and Israel must ensure its operations are proportionate to the threat posed. Israel must halt settlements which are illegal and undermine the viability of a Palestinian state and the security of both Israelis and Palestinians. The violent settlers must be held to account. The UK has introduced 3 rounds of sanctions on violent settlers and their supporters to bring accountability for abuses of human rights, in the absence of sufficient Israeli action. We will consider all further options. Reports of the killing of Palestinian civilians in the West Bank, including children, are abhorrent. The IDF must take all precautions to prevent civilian deaths, and must investigate civilian deaths thoroughly and demonstrate full accountability to the law. The level of restrictions on Palestinian movement in the West Bank are crippling. These only fuel further instability. It is important, especially during the month of Ramadan, that religious freedoms are respected. Restrictive visa and registration processes are also deeply concerning. Israel must ensure the UN, including UNRWA, can provide essential humanitarian and service delivery in a safe and secure environment. President, 17 months on from the dreadful attacks of 7 October, we urge all parties to implement the ceasefire agreement in full and to work towards a 2-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. This is the best way to deliver a peaceful future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to thank Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her comprehensive briefing. Madam President, we are now awaiting Eid al-Fitr, one of the biggest holidays for Muslims around the world, including those in Palestine. When this year's Ramadan started a month ago, we were filled with both hope and anxiety that the hard-won ceasefire in Gaza could and should be extended. However, we are shocked and saddened that the renewed offensive is endangering Palestinian civilians in Gaza again. We are also heading toward this year's Passover, commemorating the anniversary of the exodus of the Jewish people. It is deeply regrettable that the families of hostages still held in Gaza are losing hope that they will be able to spend this year's holiday with their loved ones. Since the resumption of the offensive in Gaza earlier this week, hundreds of Palestinians, as well as UN staff members, lost their lives. At the same time, 59 Israeli hostages are still being held by Hamas, many of whom are presumed dead. As such, we call on parties to this conflict to prioritize innocent people's lives and go back to negotiations to secure a return to the ceasefire and release of hostages. Madam President, while the international community is horrified by the recent resumption of casualties and destruction in Gaza, we should not look away from the grim situation in the West Bank that has been constantly deteriorating. We are seriously concerned by the ongoing Israeli operations in the northern West Bank, which have displaced over 40,000 Palestinians in only 2 months. It is disturbing that since January 21st, when Israel commenced military operations there, more than 70 Palestinians have been killed. We are also alarmed by the ongoing expansion of its settlements. Contrary to resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly, as well as international law, combined with the persistent violence by settlers and the demolition of Palestinian homes. We are deeply concerned that UNHCR's recent report detailed the significant expansion of settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the report pointed out how Israel's gradual transfer of powers over the occupied Palestinian territory to the Israeli civilian authorities is consolidating this worrisome trend. The ongoing violence and vandalism by Israeli settlers against Palestinian civilians and their property, often with total impunity under the protection of Israeli forces, are unacceptable. These honorable acts, including the targeting of livestock and olive trees, are hampering the livelihoods of Palestinians and driving them off their land, changing the demographic composition of the West Bank. Madam President, Resolution 2334 in 2016 was a milestone Security Council resolution. It provides a number of important elements, including the cessation of settlement activities and immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, based on international humanitarian law, which prohibits an occupying power from imposing permanent changes on the occupied territory. In this regard, it is regrettable that, according to UNHCR, the number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, already exceeds 700,000. Also troubling is that some Israeli leaders have recently advocated for re-establishing settlements in the Gaza Strip as well. Madam President, we note with deep concern that since the horrendous terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th, opposition to the vision of the two-state solution has increased in Israel, as demonstrated by last year's overwhelming approval for a rejection of Palestinian statehood in the Israeli Knesset. However, we need to acknowledge that sustainable peace and stability can only be achieved when both the legitimate aspirations of Palestinians and the legitimate security concerns of Israelis are met simultaneously. Therefore, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its belief that the two-state solution, where two democratic states living side by side in peace, is the only viable option to achieve a just and durable peace. We encourage Israel, as well as the Palestinians, to recognize this proposition as being attainable. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag for her comprehensive briefing on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334 and the current situation unfolding in the Gaza Strip and West Bank. The provisions of Resolution 2334 are unequivocal in outlining Israel's legal obligations to protect all civilians. They specifically condemn actions aimed at altering the demographic composition of Palestinian territories, including the construction and expansion of settlements, home demolitions, and the displacement of Palestinian civilians, all of which constitute violations of international law. These actions represent a significant obstacle to peace and the two-state solution. We regret that this reporting period has seen a significant escalation of tensions in the West Bank. Israel's Operation Iron Wall, which began around the same time as the most recent but now breached Gaza ceasefire in January, has resulted in intensified military operations in heavily populated areas in Tulkarem, Jenin, Nushams, Tobas, and others. While Israel has reported that these operations are in response to militant activity, The military actions, combined with settler violence, raids, and confrontations between Israelis and Palestinians, have devastated refugee camps and communities. This has resulted in the tragic loss of lives, including children, and displaced tens of thousands of civilians. This represents the largest population displacement in the northern West Bank since the 1967 war. Madam President, a military solution will not resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as decades of bombings, airstrikes, and terror attacks have demonstrated. Israel's violation of the Gaza ceasefire agreement and Hamas's recent rocket attacks into Israel can only exacerbate an already fragile situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, plunging the civilian population further into devastation and suffering. Most troubling, history has shown that such actions breed continuous cycles of hatred and violence, with the deadly consequences for both Israel and Palestine, as well as the wider region. Despite these seemingly intractable challenges, our goal should remain to define a path toward a peaceful resolution of this conflict that ensures the safety of all civilians, the release of all hostages, unimpeded humanitarian assistance, and a political horizon in line with international law. With this in mind, we make the following 3 points. First, we remain deeply concerned that as the humanitarian needs in the West Bank and Gaza Strip grow, UNRWA, the main humanitarian organization in the territory, is facing severe security, administrative, and operational challenges that hinder its ability to serve the thousands of civilians reliant on its assistance. Despite Israeli restrictions on humanitarian aid to Gaza, UNRWA and other agencies, including the WFP and UNICEF, continue to provide life-saving food, water, medical care, and sanitation. In this regard, we call for the immediate reopening of all humanitarian aid corridors. We also condemn the killing of UNRWA employees and one UNOP staff member. Noting the statement by the Secretary General's spokesperson that the locations of UN facilities in Gaza are well known to all parties, we call on all parties to respect and protect UN and humanitarian aid workers in accordance with international humanitarian law. Simultaneously, we urge the international community to bolster support for humanitarian and reconstruction efforts in Gaza and the West Bank. Second, Sierra Leone recalls General Assembly Resolution ES 10/24 of 18th September 2024, which addressed the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. This resolution calls for an end to all actions that harm the civilian population in the occupied territories and undermine the two-state solution. We urge the parties to refrain from unilateral actions, provocations, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric that erode trust, hinder dialogue, and obstruct the path to negotiations. Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank and the demolition of Palestinian homes must cease immediately. Third, we emphasize the critical importance of revitalizing the political process, which will undoubtedly pave the way for a negotiated two-state solution, promote sustainable development, and foster a just and lasting peace in the region. In this context, the international conference to be co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia in June 2025 offers a crucial opportunity for consolidating positions and agreeing on concrete measures to establish a durable political and security framework for the region. We also remain hopeful for the recovery and reconstruction of Gaza, guided by the proposal tabled by the League of Arab States in Cairo, Egypt. The Palestinian Authority must be supported in its efforts to build a safe and prosperous state of Palestine that lives in peaceful coexistence with Israel. In conclusion, Madam President, international humanitarian law and the relevant Security Council resolutions is not a mere formality. It is a reminder of each member state duty. It is a reminder of each member state's duty to uphold the principles of humanity, justice, and accountability, and to do so consistently without selectivity or double standards. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to express our sincere appreciation to the Special Coordinator, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, for her comprehensive briefings, and Somalia fully supports the Secretary General's report. Madam President, recent days have brought devastating development that surpass our darkest predictions. The spiral of violence in Gaza and the West Bank have reached catastrophic levels, with the past 48 hours marking especially tragic escalation. Overnight strikes have claimed innocent lives. Families asleep in their beds have been torn apart. Many victims still lie beneath the rubble of the Tuesday's attack. Their fates is unknown. We are deeply disturbed by the continued targeting of UN personnel and facilities. The killing of UNOPOS staff member and multiple UNRWA personnel represents unconscionable violation of international humanitarian law. These dedicated humanitarian workers serving under the UN flag should never become casualties of a conflict. The targeting of UN premises in the humanitarian condition in Gaza and the West Bank. The flow of essential aid has virtually ceased, leaving Gaza cut off from basic necessities like food, fuel, power, and medical supplies. Let's be clear. International law mandates that Israel, as occupying power, must ensure civilians' access to these fundamental necessities. The timing of this blockade during the holy month of Ramadan compounds an already critical situation. The statistics are stark. Merely 10% of Gazan populations can access clean water, and the territory's sole desalination facility have ceased operation because of the power shortage. Moreover, Palestinians must be allowed to observe the sacred last 10 days of Ramadan in Al-Aqsa al-Sharif Mosque as in their rights. We firmly reject any use of humanitarian aid as a negotiating tool or deployment of starvation as a military strategy. Such actions represent a clear breach of international humanitarian law and fundamental human dignity. Madam President, the situation in West Bank continues to deteriorate, marked by the persistent violations of Resolution 2334. The acceleration of settlement expansion, demolitions, and evictions directly contravenes this resolution's provisions. My mission strongly condemns the closing of schools run by UNRWA and terrorizing the students and UNRWA staff, as reported by Ms. Kaag. These actions, coupled with increasing settler violence and establishment of new outposts, is a violation of international law and is a deliberate attempt to undermine the viability of the two-state solutions. The UN Security Council and the international community cannot remain silent as these violations of Resolution 2334 continues unabated, threatening the territorial continuity of the future Palestinian state. We must present a united front against genocide, forced demographics, we must present a united front against the genocide, forced demographic changes, and ethnic cleansing, displacement from Palestinian communities, or attempts to annex territories in their Gaza or West Bank. If there is a true commitment to sustainable peace, international law must be upheld, and this includes putting an immediate halt to all these violations. Madam President, the way forward demands three critical steps. First, an immediate restoration of unrestricted humanitarian access, addressing the severe funding shortfall currently at a mere 4% of required resources. This must include guaranteeing protection of humanitarian workers and UN personnel. Second, a swift return to a ceasefire and complete cessation of hostilities. All parties must fully implement Security Council Resolution 2735 and engage constructively with mediators from Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to complete the subsequent phases of the ceasefire agreement. Lastly, only the establishment of free, sovereign Palestine state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital, in accordance with the relevant resolutions, can provide a lasting solution to this enduring conflict. My delegation remains committed to these endeavors and will continue work together to achieve a just and lasting peace in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank Special Coordinator ad interim, Madam Sigrid Kaag, for her briefing. While we began discussing the reconstruction of Gaza and the plan endorsed by both the League of Arab States and the OIC, and triggering effort aiming to mobilize resources, financial resources, for its realization in the perspective of the upcoming meeting in Cairo. The Israeli occupying power have, as expected, yes, as expected, shown a different approach. They have resumed their aggression. They have resumed their indiscriminate bombardment of Gaza. They have blatantly breached the ceasefire agreement, completely disregarding their commitments and with no regard for the mediators who are also the guarantor of this ceasefire agreement. The Israeli Minister of Defense warns of total destruction of Gaza. In fact, this should not be surprising, as peace has never been their priority, nor in their agenda. On the contrary, constant instability and war is their objective. Madam President, images of horrors we once thought were part of history, following the ceasefire agreement sealed last January, have now resurfaced. People in Gaza are just terrified, helpless, devastated. In just one night, last Wednesday, over 400 people were killed in Gaza, including 174 children. 174 children, 89 women, 32 elderly individuals. More than 500 people were injured, dying every minute due to the lack of medical equipment after 18 months of aggression and blockade. These figures should be added to more than 48,000 Palestinians, among them 17,000 children, 12,000 women, and 2,000 elderly killed since October the 7th. The Israeli occupying forces are also targeting those who have chosen to serve the Palestinian civilians and uphold humanity. I mean, aid workers. In recent days, one UNOPS staff member and 5 UNRWA workers have been killed. These victims have been considered legitimate targets by the Israeli occupying forces. This is barbarity that serves as a grim reminder of why we, international community, have established international humanitarian law. However, for the Israeli occupying power, international law, international humanitarian law are meaningless. Let me be clear. The protection of civilians is not an option. It is an obligation. Facilitating humanitarian aid access is not an option. It is an obligation. Respecting principles such as distinction and proportionality is not an option. It is an obligation. All parties must abide by international humanitarian law and comply with their commitments as agreed in the ceasefire agreement as reflected in our resolution 2735. The ceasefire must continue, and all phases of the deal must be implemented toward a permanent and complete ceasefire. When it comes to respecting international law, there must be no double standard. Every single rule must be respected by all. Madam President, the Israeli tactics are not limited to Gaza, but are obvious throughout the entire occupying Palestinian territories. The Israeli occupying authority do not deny, nor they conceal their objective: the annihilation of the prospect of the Palestinian state, the ejection, yes, the ejection of the Palestinian people from their homeland. And the Israeli authorities' objective in the West Bank specifically is clear: total sovereignty over it. And their modus operandi is also well known: killing Palestinian civilians, demolition of their home, displacement, dispossession, and finally, settlement. These last days, over 40,000 people have been forcibly displaced in the past 2 months in the West Bank. refugee camps at Jenin, at Tulkarem, are now literally empty from their residents, who were refugees protected by international humanitarian law. Hundreds of houses have been destroyed. 500 houses and civilian infrastructure have been demolished in Jenin. The dispossession of Palestinian land has reached unprecedented levels, and recently, the Israeli Authority notified the evacuation of land west of Jenin for the first time since the Oslo Agreement. President, in the West Bank, and since October 7, nearly 900 Palestinians, including 180 children, have been killed, and 4,000 have been injured. In the same time, over 10,000 housing units are being built for Israeli settlers. And 50 Israeli outposts have been constructed. It is an unprecedented matter, an unprecedented number. Settler violence continues with total impunity, and report of an average of 120 incidents of settler violence in the West Bank every month. These are blatant violations of UN resolution. In particular, our resolution 2334. We must ask ourselves honestly, is this the behavior of a party that seeks peace? Madam President, the source of suffering in the occupying Palestinian territories for all parties, for all of us, is the prolonged Israeli occupation of Arab land. You cannot occupy a territory, deny its people their rights, humiliate them, take their lives, and expect to achieve security. True security can only be attained through diplomatic means, through dialogue, and by recognizing the right of the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, the Israeli occupying authorities have chosen a different path and are trying to create a new reality in the territories. New reality that will make the establishment of Palestinian state impossible. Israel is a UN member that is openly challenging the collective will of the international community, the will of the Security Council, as no other member has in history. When will we rise to the level of our obligations? When will we impose respect and implementation for our collective decision to establish a Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital? I thank you.
Representative of Algeria for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation. Sorry.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель.
Thank you, Madam President.
Благодарим его спецкоординатора ООН по Ближневосточному мирному процессу Сигрид Каг за обстоятельный доклад о выполнении резолюции Совета Безопасности 2334. К сожалению, как ясно из вашего выступления, прогресса на этом направлении по-прежнему нет. На этой неделе мы уже дважды имели возможность обсудить ситуацию в секторе Газа на фоне возобновления там израильской военной операции. Сегодня же в фокусе нашего внимания непрекращающаяся операция израильских силовиков и столкновение местных жителей с поселенцами и на западном берегу реки Иордан, который рискует повторить сценарий Газа. Расширяется охват операции «Железная стена», где впервые за 2 десятилетия задействовано тяжелое вооружение, включая танки. В результате рейда армия обороны Израиля в лагере беженцев Аль-Айн, провинции Наблус, убит 1 человек и несколько получили ранения. Один из заключенных, освобожденный в рамках последней сделки между Хамас и Израилем, скончался от полученных ранений в Бейт-Джале. Всего с ноября 2023 года 2023 to 21 October 2024, altogether in the West Bank, 620 Palestinians and 24 Israelis were killed. There's a continued systemic destruction of Palestinian dwellings. In the camp in Jenin alone, in one day, 66 houses were destroyed according to the Israeli decisions. And Fatah has already called it an ethnic cleansing. Since the beginning of the operation, 40,000 refugees had to leave their homes. There is a greater restriction on checkpoints in the West Bank. It's more difficult to get to markets or in places of employment, healthcare facilities, and education facilities. In parallel to that, senior Israeli officials are voicing their plans to fully annex the territory in what they call the historic Judea and Samaria. In the southern part of Jablun in Jenin, 12 hectares of land were annexed, and the Israeli authorities informed Ramallah of that. Overall, among 2.7 million of Palestinians on the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which was captured in 1967 by Israel, about 700,000 Israeli settlers live, and in the last year, plans were approved for tens of thousands new residential units there. All of these steps ultimately are aimed to undermine the two-state solutions, and there are open statements against this in the Knesset. Призываем Израиль немедленно прекратить всю поселенческую деятельность, вывести поселенцев на родину, прекратить насильственное перемещение палестинцев и предотвращать нападения на них со стороны поселенцев и сотрудников правоохранительных. Госпожа председатель, происходящее на Западном берегу красноречиво иллюстрирует тезис о безальтернативности поиска политических решений конфликта. Сложилась парадоксальная ситуация, при которой Израиль, желая обеспечить безопасность собственных граждан, продолжает колонизацию палестинских земель, вызывая тем самым ненависть со стороны проживающего там на протяжении последних веков арабского населения. В ответ на порождаемое своими действиями насилие израильтяне отвечают еще большей violence, the Israelis reply with even greater cruelty and accelerated settlement, and this in turn completes the vicious circle. Given that Israel is using crude force almost exclusively to ensure their security, well, we shouldn't be surprised that the radical forces are very popular amongst ordinary Palestinians, and that the militarized groups in the occupied Palestinian territory never have a problem with recruitment. The only sensible alternative to this is for Israel to stop their discriminatory actions and settlement activity and return to the negotiations, which should ensure a peaceful coexistence for the two peoples within two states. What is needed for that is a full and unconditional compliance with Security Council Resolution 2334, abandoning plans to annex Palestinian territory and to forcibly displace Palestinians. What is also needed is to ensure there is proper political and financial assistance to the Palestinian Authority. Strengthening them is the best guarantee of Israel's security. Unfortunately, we have to recognize that under the conditions of resumed Israeli military operation in Gaza, the prospects for normalizing the West Bank cannot be identified. Therefore, an imperative here is a swift return to a ceasefire, opening full humanitarian access, and continued exchanges of those detained. It's extremely important to make sure that any agreements are sustainable in nature. Otherwise, as practice has shown, they can collapse at any moment. We are convinced that the Security Council can and should play its role in the negotiating process and ensuring that its outcomes are honored by all sides. And we call on the mediators to prioritize this scenario that I just mentioned, and we hope that the common sense will prevail and the parties will be able to get back to the negotiating table. Madam President, in conclusion, I would like to reaffirm our steadfast commitment to a Palestinian state within 1967 borders with a capital in East Jerusalem, coexisting in peace and security with Israel, in line with the approved international legal decisions. Our position is consistent and is not subject to situational changes. We are also firmly committed to supporting UNRWA. The agency is called upon to assist the Palestinians until such time as they have a state of their own. I thank you.
Thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I give the floor now to Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Coordinator CAG for presenting the Secretary General's report on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. Madam President, Guyana stresses the imperative of full and faithful compliance with Resolution 2334. We are troubled at reports of heightened violations by all parties concerned of the said resolution contrary to international law, including the legal directives of the International Court of Justice. Guyana recalls this Council's vision of a region where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. We call on the Council to shoulder its responsibilities in this regard and to work constructively to bring an end to the current hostilities and military operations in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which add to the toll of death, displacement, and destruction, and continue to put thousands of Palestinian lives and livelihoods at great risk. Madam President, this Council has long taken note of the impact of the Israeli settlement policies and practices on Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and on the prospects for the two-state solution and a durable peace between Israelis and Palestinians. We therefore cannot but be concerned that the ceasefire brokered between Israel and Hamas has been interrupted, with a resulting new wave of violence once again entrapping innocent civilians, not least children, who, according to UNICEF, experienced on 18th March their, and I quote, largest single-day death toll, end of quote, in a year, more than 130 of them killed. This Council has a duty to act, to end violence and bloodshed, to rekindle hope for durable peace and normality, where people are able to live, work, and worship in freedom, and avert further endangerment of peace and security in the region and beyond. Madam President, we therefore urgently need a new political horizon to move us beyond the status quo and to advance the two-state solution. The recovery and reconstruction of Gaza is an integral part of this equation, and the plan proposed by the Arab group is a good basis on which to take this forward. To this end, allow me to reiterate the following 4 appeals. First, Guyana calls once again for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and for the cessation of all actions and uprooting of all ideologies that rationalize the perpetration of war. We call on Israel and Hamas to negotiate in good faith, to bring about compliance with Security Council Resolution 2735. We also call for the cessation of hostilities in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Second, Guyana calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held in Gaza. We also call for all Palestinians detained in Israeli jails to be released. Both hostages and detainees must be treated with dignity and respect and allowed humanitarian access by the ICRC. Third, we call for the aid blockade to be removed and for full, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access to all civilians in need, including to facilitate medical evacuations. Finally, we call for Israel to comply with its international obligations as an occupying power, including its obligation not to annex any of the territory pertaining to Palestine. Israel's colonial settler policy and practices must cease, and it must withdraw to the pre-1967 lines in accordance with the ICJ advisory opinion of 19 July 2024. Guyana commits to continue its strong engagement on the question of Palestine with a view to contributing to a just and lasting solution. I thank you, Madam President.
And I thank the representative of Guyana for this statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Denmark. I would like to start by thanking Special Coordinator Kark for your very detailed and insightful report. Denmark deplores the breakdown of the ceasefire and the subsequent resumption of the Israeli airstrikes and renewed ground operations in Gaza with further devastation for the civilian population. We deeply regret the death of a UNOF staff member and 5 UNRWA staff and echo the Secretary General's condemnation of all attacks on UN personnel. Denmark stands firm in our calls for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages and for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. We call on Israel to live up to its obligations under international law, including the resumption of unimpeded entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Colleagues, in December 2016, this Council came together to adopt Resolution 2334. That decision, born of the collective and urgent desire to further the two-state solution, offered hope. Hope for a just and lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Today, more than 8 years later, the path to a two-state solution is threatened more than ever. It is threatened in particular by 4 compounding and converging developments. Firstly, the conflict brought on by Hamas' terror attack on October 7th and the divisions it has deepened. Second, the largest displacement of civilians in the West Bank since 1967, a result of the security situation and the Israeli military operations in the northern West Banks. Third, a weakening of the 2 pillars of stability in the West Bank, UNRWA and the Palestinian Authority. And finally, the topic of today's briefing, settlements. And let there be no doubt, settlements, which are in clear violation of international law, also undermine prospects for a two-state solution. The development robs Palestinians of their land, pushes them into isolated enclaves, making it virtually impossible to form a connected and viable land for a future Palestinian state. In 2024, we saw a more rapid expansion of settlements in the West Bank than ever before. This includes the establishment of more than 50 new outposts, 8 of these in Area B, the first establishment in this area since the Oslo Accords. Reading these reports of zones, area classifications, and constructions, it can almost sound like a technical issue. But in fact, settlements cause serious, lasting hardship and suffering. The reality is, Palestinian families are ordered from their land. They are left watching as their homes are demolished. They may return again during the night to rebuild their homes, only to see them demolished again. These families are then faced with an impossible choice: stay and tolerate the intolerable, or leave and permanently lose their land. We once again call on Israel to immediately halt all settlement expansion on Palestinian land. Any unilateral attempt to change the demography of the occupied Palestinian territories is unacceptable and constitutes a clear violation of international law. According to the ICJ, policies, practices, or other measures that seek to bring the occupied territory under Israel's permanent control constitute acts of annexation contrary to international law. Some settlements come about through settler violence, in which we have seen an alarming escalation with very little accountability. We are deeply concerned by reports that the Israeli military often cooperates with settlers, including by sending troops to escort settlers and sometimes joining in effects to expel Palestinian residents. This is unacceptable, and it must stop now. We remind Israel of its responsibility as the occupying power for abuses committed by security forces as well as its nationals. We call on Israel to hold these settlers to account. In the European Union, we have imposed sanctions on extremist settlers. International scrutiny of these violations continues to be hindered if the UN system and other actors are refused visas and thereby unable to exercise their functions, including independent reporting. Colleagues, let me be clear. Denmark remains firmly committed to Israel's security. This is why we cannot let the two-state solution disappear before our eyes. We have the frameworks. What is needed is implementation. Full implementation of Resolution 2334 and other relevant resolutions. Full respect for the advisory opinions of the ICJ. A resumption of the ceasefire and release of all hostages. Reform and revitalization of the Palestinian Authority. In short, we need to create the conditions for the realization of the two-state solution. Israelis and Palestinians deserve a just and lasting peace now. Around this table, we must do everything in our power to support that. I resume my functions now as President of the Council, and I give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, at the outset, we thank Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her reporting, including on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. Israel believes it has found the solution to the Palestine question, a solution it has often pursued in the past, but never so openly, brazenly, and viciously. The Palestinians will have to choose death in their land or life elsewhere. Instead of ending its occupation, its illegal occupation, it is attempting to end the occupied people. This is evident in the genocide still underway in Gaza to promote the so-called voluntary migration of Palestinians, the code name of mass forcible displacement and transfer of the Palestinian people from their land. But this is also evident in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, in the latest and most massive ethnic cleansing campaign since 1967. This crime is taking place as we speak in the northern part of the West Bank, while all eyes are on the horrific genocide in Gaza. Israel has forcibly displaced, as many of you have indicated, over 40,000 Palestinians in a matter of weeks. It is destroying refugee camps in an attempt to convince Palestine refugees that not only will they not return to their homes, villages, and towns, but that their only horizon is to be displaced time and time again. You can see with your bare eyes destruction and expulsion of entire communities, the physical and violent uprooting of families from their homes and their lands, forced to leave their lives behind. Palestinians have spent decades rebuilding their lives over and over again. And Israel, within days, has destroyed yet again all that they have built. Devastation to achieve displacement. Displacement to achieve annexation. The playbook is well known by now. The crimes fully documented. Madam President, we have said repeatedly, Israel's goal has always been maximum Palestinian land with minimum Palestinians. That it wanted control of Palestinian geography and therefore was attacking Palestinian demography. We said that so many times. Repeating sometimes is useful. While the entire world says there is no alternative to the two-state solution, and we appreciate that all of you keep repeating that, Israel on the ground continues to entertain the deadly illusion that it can destroy the Palestinian people to prevent the self-determination of our people and the independence of our state. The Israeli government is willing to use airstrikes in densely populated neighborhoods to bulldoze entire camps and to resort to mass killing, mass detention, and mass displacement to destroy homes and infrastructure, and along with Israeli settlers to intimidate, assault, and terrorize an entire civilian population to achieve its illegal goals. Now, the question is, what is the world willing to do? To defend its vision, to uphold its laws, to stop this madness. We appreciate your reiteration of commitment to international law, to two-state solution, to the fact that settlements are illegal and should be dismantled. We appreciate that. But that is not sufficient. What are you going to do in order to stop Israel from continuing on this path and to give them a strong injection to wake up and to know that they will not be able to accomplish that objective? What are you going to do? The Israeli plan relies on its assumption that it will not face a decisive international response and clear consequences for its crimes and unlawful actions. So when you reiterate the principles, they take note and they continue with their illegal action. So the reiteration is not sufficient, although it is good. What are you going to do to match your words with deeds, with what is required in order to accomplish the objective of allowing the Palestinian people to exercise their inalienable rights, including their right to self-determination, independence, statehood, and the return of the refugees? Confronted with this unprecedented Israeli escalation, there must be an unprecedented escalation of international measures and response. If you do not escalate your action, concrete action, in upholding international law, defending Security Council resolutions and UN resolution, Israel is not going to change its behavior. So therefore, you have to act. As we were reminded yesterday by the President of the Security Council, and as she reminded us again today. International law is clear. The International Court of Justice advisory opinion is clear. A number of you refer to that. UN resolutions are clear, including Security Council Resolution 2334. And the calls and obligations most recently affirmed in General Assembly Resolution ES-10/24. It is time for implementation. You are absolutely correct, Madam President. You want implementation. This is time for implementation. It is time for accountability. For those who refuse to honor and respect their obligation under the Charter, including implementations of Security Council resolutions, there should be consequences. They cannot belong to this club without abiding by the Constitution and the Charter of this club. You have to honor and respect and implement what we collectively decide. Otherwise, there will be consequences, so that the one that is not respecting the law should face the consequences of such rebellions. Madam President, the Security Council and the General Assembly have called for ending the Israel. They have repeatedly condemned Israelis' settlement activities while witnessing their constant acceleration. They have condemned settlers' violence, while each year it reached new heights. They have denounced these actions while witnessing the fragmentation of the Palestinian land, the displacement of the Palestinian people, and the pillage of their natural resources. They have called for upholding the historic status quo at Al-Haram al-Sharif, while Israeli breaches continue and intensify, including during the holy month of Ramadan. The ICJ, in its opinion delivered last year, deemed Israelis' continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, to be unlawful and has called for bringing it to an end as rapidly as possible. It stressed the many Israeli policies and practices that were illegal and called for them to be brought to an immediate end. The Israeli government, so accustomed and addicted to impunity, will not heed these calls and instead continues to demonstrate its contempt for the fundamental rules and institutions of our international law-based order. Israel's aim is to render its illegal colonial occupation irreversible through the forcible displacement of our people and the annexation of our land. It is entrenching its occupation instead of reversing and ending it. The decisions that states are willing to take, individually and collectively, in the coming days and weeks, in support of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, in rejection of the unlawful acquisition of territory by force, and in order to salvage the prospects of shared peace, security, and prosperity in our region, will determine what happens next. Your action will determine what happens next. These measures should be adopted right now, before it is too late. The International Conference for the Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution, to be held in June under the co-chairmanship of Saudi Arabia and France, must be a platform for mobilization and action where states clearly determine how they can correctly contribute to upholding international law, where they will affirm the steps they will take to implement their obligations, including under Resolution 2334, towards bringing an end to the occupation and salvaging peace. This conference is not going to be an ordinary conference where people come, read statements, and a declaration will be adopted and business as usual. No. This is a conference that will be and should be, through the will of all of you, through declaring ahead of time your commitments and obligations of how you can act in order to shorten the life of this illegal occupation in order to accomplish your global consensus on the two-state solution. That's what is needed, and that's what should be done, and that is what will be unfolding with the help of all those who are serious about accomplishing the two-state solution, I believe, very soon at the beginning of next month. These measures should be adopted right now. As I said, I read that. Madam President, the Israeli Minister of War proudly declared days ago, and I quote, 40,000 Palestinians evicted so far. The Jenin, Tulkarem, and Nur Shams refugee camps, now unpopulated. UNRWA activities in the camps was seized. I ordered the Israeli Defense Forces to remain in the cleansed camps for the next year and prevent inhabitants from returning. End of quotation. At the same time, he declared that Israel will advance its plans for annexation of areas of Gaza and continue pushing Palestinians out, terrorizing our people with bombs, evacuation orders, and shocking leaflets aimed to cause fear and panic. Israel's intentions have never been clearer. The international response needs to be equally clear. They cannot be crystal clear in what they want to do, and you are not going to be crystal clear in how you are going to stop it. You have to be crystal clear as well. While Israeli actions are met with worldwide condemnation and rejection, while states have in fact taken a number of measures and initiatives in opposition to these actions, we are far from reaching the necessary threshold to force Israel to revise its plans and calculations. We need to do more to reach the tipping point. We are not there. We need to do more. There is often talk about the need to be realistic. We need to be realistic about what needs to be done to bring us back from the brink. That's what we need to be realistic about. And that entails brave and unprecedented decisions by states to use all the tools available to them to change the course of history, to ensure that the arc of moral universe bends toward justice. I thank you very much, Madam President.
And I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Special Coordinator Kach, for your briefing. Today and yesterday, certain members of this council made an outrageous comparison, one so morally obscene that it must be addressed at the outset. They equated the Israeli hostages held in brutal captivity underground by Hamas with Palestinian terrorists legally arrested by Israel. Let me be clear. The Israeli hostages are innocent men, women, and children, abducted for no reason other than being Israeli or foreigners who were in Israel on October 7th. They are being starved, tortured, and hidden away in Hamas's underground dungeons. In contrast, Palestinians who have been arrested by Israel are terrorists, many with blood on their hands. They have committed the most heinous acts of terror, from cold-blooded murder to producing suicide bombs to planning mass casualty attacks. For the sake of freeing our hostages, we found ourselves in an impossible position, having to release many of these prisoners. Among them were 200 convicted murderers serving life sentences for killing Israelis or Palestinians. But they were convicted. Just because we were forced to exchange murderers for innocence does not mean there is any point of comparison. Do not be mistaken. Anyone who attempts to draw such an equation is intentionally promoting Hamas propaganda. The Palestinian prisoners are fed, clothed, and protected. They have access to legal counsel and the benefit of a robust and independent judiciary that will review their cases without bias. To compare them to hostages is not only an insult to the victims, it is plain moral bankruptcy. We have unfortunately come to expect such bankruptcy from some at this table. Madam President, Israel has returned to war in Gaza. This is not a decision we made lightly, but one that was forced upon us by Hamas. After weeks, we waited for weeks. After weeks of negotiations, after offering to extend the ceasefire in good faith, Hamas refused to release our hostages and continued to stall negotiations. They knew it's Ramadan, they knew it's Passover coming, but they decided to reject all offers. The world watched as Hamas spat in our face and the face of the Israeli people waiting for the return of their loved ones. The world watched as Hamas rejected every opportunity to return 59 innocent men, women, and children home. Israel had no choice but to act. So we are acting decisively. We are striking Hamas targets with precision. In recent days, Israel has eliminated several top Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists. They include Mahmoud Marzouk Ahmad Abu Atfa, responsible for Hamas's internal security forces, Rashid Jihad, head of Hamas's general security forces, and Hassam El-Dalias, head of the Hamas government in Gaza, and a key authority figure. Along with these arch-terrorists, several senior terrorist commanders have also been eliminated. We want our people back. But until Hamas returns our hostages, the destruction of their regime will continue without delay, without pause. Hamas has a choice. They can come back to the table and negotiate, or they can wait and watch their leadership fall one by one. We will not stop until our people come home, all of them. Colleagues, amid all the noise, one fact will forever remain unchanged. Israel will never again tolerate threats to our civilians, from any place, from any group, anywhere. There will be no exceptions. How many times we spoke about Hamas in Gaza and about the threat it poses on our communities? It was ignored. It will not happen again. We will do whatever is necessary to protect our people from Palestinian terrorism, from Houthi terrorism, from Iranian terrorism, from terrorism of any kind. If history has taught us anything, is that the world cannot be trusted to do it for us. We will do it ourselves. the empty words for many of these council members, their deafening silence in the face of terror have only emboldened those who seek our destruction. The world watched as Hamas turned Gaza into a terror state. I want to remind you, we left Gaza in 2005. Mr. Mansour can tell you what they did to his colleagues. They threw them off the rooftops. They took over Gaza, and we saw what happened there. The world watched as Hamas turned Gaza into a terror state. Israel does not have the luxury of ignorance. We do not have the luxury of waiting for another massacre before acting. And now let's speak about Judea and Samaria. Our actions in Judea and Samaria are essential. In the past 16 months alone, well over 2,000 attempted terror attacks have originated from Judea and Samaria. No one mentioned that. In just the past few months, 46 people have been murdered in terror attacks. No one mentioned that. More than 1,200 others have been injured. This year, innocent lives have already been stolen. Among them, 75-year-old Tamar Edri. Over 100 more have been injured. They are fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. Entire families torn apart by the same forces that carried out the atrocities of October 7. And these terrorists do not operate in isolation. What is happening in Judea and Samaria is not just an internal security matter. It is another front in Iran's multi-front war against Israel and the Jewish people. But it is also the byproduct of the Palestinian Authority's stunning incompetence, negligence, and growing irrelevance. And I will elaborate on that later. But let's be clear. The invisible hand behind this chaos is Iran. It is Iran that arms, funds, and directs Hamas and other terror cells in Judea and Samaria, just as it does in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. It is Iran that has spent years infiltrating Palestinian terrorist organizations, smuggling in weapons, training their operatives, and flooding the region with advanced explosives. Iran has established and maintains Islamist terrorist frameworks in Judea and Samaria through Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It authorizes attacks and transfers millions of dollars every year to support these terrorists, some of whom the Palestinian Authority is also trying to capture. They are trying. For example, Islam Azaiza was arrested not by us, by the Palestinian Authority for its involvement in terror attacks, including against the PA. However, it further came to light that during the interrogation, they found out that it wasn't only himself. He had 8 other Palestinian terrorists that were managing funds supplied by Iran to support their terror in Judea and Samaria. Iran's influence does not stop at funding. Through its terrorist mechanisms and proxies, it is attempting to transfer massive quantities of weapons, including munitions, anti-tank weapons, and explosives, into the hands of terrorists. The IDF's operations in Judea and Samaria are focused on disrupting these activities, breaking down terrorist networks, and dismantling Iranian influence before it can spread further. Israel has also intercepted countless shipments of Iranian weaponry, disguised as civilian cargo. But we cannot stop everything. We cannot intercept them all. The world should not pretend that these weapons are for anything other than the slaughter of innocent Israelis. Iran is working tirelessly to turn Judea and Samaria into a second Gaza. They succeeded already. Look what happened to Gaza for 2005. They succeeded. Now they're trying to do the same in Judea and Samaria. But what the Palestinian Authority truly done to stop it? Nothing. This is not for lack of trying. Because as Mr. Mansour can tell you, they have tried. The PA has attempted many counter-terrorism operations to dismantle the terror networks entrenched in their backyard. But it has failed. It has been unable to remove the terror groups controlling cities, not streets, not neighborhoods, cities, like Jenin, Tulkarem. Mr. Mansour, we listen very carefully to all of your very long speeches, very patiently. But let's be honest for a moment. Let's talk about the real facts, what's happening in Judea and Samaria. Let's talk about the Palestinian Authority's Jenin operations you conducted in January, not us. The PA, Special Forces, Security Services, I don't know all the names of the organizations, what you did in January in Judea and Samaria. You tried. You managed to arrest 247 terrorists and seize hundreds of weapons in your operations, but utterly failed to disrupt Jenin terrorist operations. You even allowed funds meant for Gaza to be stolen under your watch. Your forces were met in those camps with resentment, distrust, and defiance, not from Israel, but from your own people. They see you as weak, corrupt, and incapable of governance. You have no control over Jenin, Mr. Mansour. You have no control over Tulkarem. Your administration is little more than a figurehead as your authority crumbles. The PA has been unable to govern, unable to provide security, and unable to contain the threat that now faces Israeli civilians. So just as we have seen before, the PA quietly steps aside and leaves the job to us. So we have to go to those camps. We have no desire to go to the camps in Nur HaShams, in Jenin, and take care of those threats and terror cells. But we have no other choice, because we know what will happen if we will wait. Those terror cells, we will see them in the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. The choice Israel faces is simple, yet most nations in this room cannot comprehend it. We either act or we wait for another massacre. We either eliminate threats or we wait until those threats take innocent lives. We have tried waiting before, and we will never make that mistake again. There will be no sanctuary for terrorists, not in Judea and Samaria, not in Gaza, not in Lebanon, not anywhere. So let all enemies of Israel, whether in Gaza, Judea and Samaria, Lebanon, Yemen, or Iran, understand this. If you seek to harm our people, we will rise and strike. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Jordan.
السيدة الرئيسة، يشرفني أن ألقي هذا البيان بالنيابة عن المجموعة العربية والتي ترأس بلادي أعمالها هذا الشهر. ويطيب لي أن أتقدم منكم بالتهنئة بمناسبة تولي بلادكم رئاسة مجلس الأمن لهذا الشهر، متمنيا لكم السداد في تيسير أعمال المجلس. كما أشكر المنسقة الخاصة لعملية السلام بالإنابة السيدة سيغريت كاغ على إحاطتها القيمة، لا سيما فيما يتعلق بتنفيذ القرار 2334 بشأن الاستيطان والانتهاكات الإسرائيلية والإجراءات الإسرائيلية الأحادية التي تواصل تنفيذها في شتى أرجاء الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة. السيدة الرئيسة، ينعقد اجتماعنا اليوم في ظرف استثنائي دقيق. ففي أعقاب الدور الهام الذي اطلعت به مصر وقطر والولايات المتحدة في التوصل لاتفاق لوقف إطلاق النار في غزة وإطلاق سراح الرهائن والمحتجزين، انتهكت إسرائيل هذا الاتفاق الذي بموجبه تم تسليم 33 من الرهائن، والذي لو استمر فسكان سيؤدي إلى إطلاق سراح باقي الرهائن وانتهاء هذه الحرب على غزة وشعبها. لكن إسرائيل يبدو أنها لا تريد إنهاء الحرب، وقررت خرق الاتفاق واستأنفت عدوانها على غزة وجرائمها تجاه الشعب الفلسطيني الأعزلي هناك، ولم تكتفي بمنع دخول الغذاء والدواء وقطع الكهرباء عن غزة، بل شنت هجوما مفاجئا وواسع النطاق للمرة الأولى منذ بداية الصفقة في ساعات الفجر من يوم الثلاثاء الماضي، وقصفت المدنيين أغلبهم من النساء والأطفال، وقتلت المئات منهم في طرف ساعات وهم نيام في خيامهم. ويتحمل الاحتلال الإسرائيلي المسؤولية كاملة عن تداعيات خرق اتفاق وقف إطلاق النار وقرارات مجلس الأمن ذات الصلة، وبالأخص القرار 2735. ونطالب المجلس بالعمل على وقف الحرب الإسرائيلية والحيلولة دون استمرار قتل المدنيين واستهدافهم وتوفير الحماية لهم في غزة. وبهذا السياق يتحتم اليوم على مجلس الأمن والمجتمع الدولي تكثيف الجهود المشتركة بغية دفع إسرائيل لاستئناف تنفيذ وقف إطلاق النار بمرحلتيه الثانية والثالثة، وإنهاء العقاب الجماعي على المدنيين في غزة، وفتح المعابر أمام المساعدات الإنسانية والإيوائية والطبية، وإعادة التيار الكهربائي إلى مختلف أنحاء غزة بشكل كاف ومستدام. كما لا بد من البدء في خطة إعادة إعمار غزة واستعادة التهدئة في الضفة الغربية والمضي قدما نحو إطلاق جهد حقيقي فاعل يهدف إلى تحقيق السلام العادل والشامل وفق إطار زمني محدد بما يضمن تحقيق السلام العادل في إطار زمني محدد بما يضمن تحقيق تطلعات الشعب الفلسطيني في الحرية والدولة المستقلة ويوفر الأمن والاستقرار للمنطقة وسائر شعوبها. السيدة الرئيسة، أكدت القمة العربية الاستثنائية التي عقدت في القاهرة أوائل الشهر الجاري على التمسك بخيار السلام العادل والدائم والشامل في حل القضية الفلسطينية ورفض أي محاولات لتهجير الشعب الفلسطيني من أرضه المحتلة وفرض حلول أحادية على حسابه، لا سيما التأكيد على حقه في تقرير مصيره واستقلال دولته على التراب الوطني الفلسطيني انسجاما مع القانون الدولي وقرارات مجلس الأمن ذات العلاقة. وفي هذا الصدد تثمن المجموعة العربية الدعم الدولي الواسع الرافض لمحاولات تهجير الشعب الفلسطيني من أرضه، ونرحب بتصريحات الرئيس الأمريكي دونالد ترامب مؤخرا بشأن عدم خروج سكان غزة من القطاع. كما نؤكد بأن خطة التعافي المبكر وإعادة إعمار غزة المقدمة من مصر بالتنسيق مع دولة فلسطين والتي تم اعتمادها في القمة العربية الاستثنائية هي خطة عربية جامعة، ونثمن الجهود المصرية الفلسطينية المشتركة في عقد مؤتمر دولي حول التعافي وإعادة الإعمار في غزة بالتعاون مع الأمم المتحدة والمزمع عقده قريبا في القاهرة. ونحث المجتمع الدولي والشركاء الإقليميين والدوليين بما في ذلك المؤسسات المالية الدولية على مشاركتهم الفاعلة وتوفير الدعم السياسي والمالي اللازم لتنفيذ خطط إعادة الإعمار وإنجاحها من أجل تسريع جهود تأهيل القطاع وإعادة إعماره في أعقاب الدمار الذي تسبب به العدوان الإسرائيلي على القطاع. السيدة الرئيسة، تشهد غزة وضعا إنسانيا كارثيا نتيجة الحرب الإسرائيلية المستمرة والتي خلفت دمارا إنسانيا هائلا في البنية التحتية والمساكن والمستشفيات والمدارس والمنشآت الحيوية والأممية، علاوة عن عشرات آلاف العائلات الغزية التي فقدت منازلها وأصبحت تعيش في ظروف قاسية دون مأوى أو إمكانية للحصول على الخدمات الأساسية مثل المياه النظيفة والكهرباء والرعاية الصحية. وتتفاقم الأزمة الإنسانية في ضوء استمرار الحرب والحصار الذي تفرضه إسرائيل على القطاع والذي يمنع وصول المساعدات الإنسانية بشكل ممنهج. وتدين المجموعة وقف إدخال المساعدات الإنسانية وقطع التيار الكهربائي عن القطاع واستخدام التجويع كوسيلة حرب وهي جميعها انتهاكات جسيمة لقواعد القانون الدولي الإنساني بما في ذلك اتفاقية جنيف الرابعة. ونؤكد أن حماية المدنيين في غزة يجب أن لا تكون موضع مفاوضات أو مساومة أو جزءا من صفقة، بل هي واجب على القوة القائمة بالاحتلال. السيدة الرئيسة، تشهد الضفة الغربية والقدس المحتلة تصعيدا خطيرا وأوضاعا مأساوية بسبب الإجراءات الإسرائيلية المستمرة من اقتحامات عسكرية للمدن الفلسطينية وتهجير للسكان وتوسيع للاستيطان غير القانوني وهدم للمنازل ومصادرة للأراضي وتدمير للبنى التحتية وانتهاك لحرمة الأماكن المقدسة في القدس الشريف. وتدين المجموعة هذه الإجراءات بما في ذلك محاولات تهجير الفلسطينيين من مساكنهم أو ضم الأراضي، ما ينذر بتفجر الأوضاع على جميع المستويات ويؤدي إلى انعدام فرص تحقيق الاستقرار والسلام في المنطقة بأكملها في انتهاكات لقرارات مجلس الأمن بما في ذلك القرار 2334 والرأي الاستشاري الصادر عن محكمة العدل الدولية في تموز الماضي حول الاحتلال الإسرائيلي للأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة. ونطالب المجتمع الدولي وبالأخص مجلس الأمن بالتصدي للانتهاكات الإسرائيلية في الضفة الغربية وللاعتداءات على المقدسات الإسلامية والمسيحية في القدس واحترام وضعها القانوني والحفاظ على الوضع التاريخي القائم فيها خاصة في شهر رمضان المبارك بما في ذلك اعتداءات المستوطنين والمتطرفين الإسرائيليين بغية الحفاظ على الاستقرار والأمن والحيلولة دون تفجر الأوضاع. كما نؤكد على الدور الهام والمحوري الذي تطلع به وكالة الأنروا في الضفة الغربية والقدس الشرقية وقطاع غزة وفي سائر مناطق عملياتها بموجب ولايتها الممنوحة لها من قبل الجمعية العامة والقرارات الأممية ذات الصلة. وتدين المجموعة العربية التشريعات التي أقرها الكنيست الإسرائيلي مؤخرا والذي تستهدف الوكالة والخدمات التي تقدمها في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة. ونحث المجتمع الدولي على تقديم الدعم السياسي والقانوني والمالي لضمان تمكن الوكالة من مواصلة دورها الذي لا غنى عنه. ونؤكد على حق اللاجئين الفلسطيني الثابت بالعودة والتعويض وفقا للقرارات الأممية ذات الصلة. وتدين المجموعة العربية الاعتداءات الإسرائيلية على الجمهورية العربية السورية والتوغل داخل أراضيها والذي يعد خرقا فاضحا للقانون الدولي وعدوانا على سيادة سوريا وتصعيدا خطيرا لن يسهم إلا في تأجيج التوتر والصراع في المنطقة. ونطالب المجتمع الدولي ومجلس الأمن بالتحرك الفوري لتطبيق القانون الدولي وإلزام إسرائيل وقف عدوانها والانسحاب من الأراضي السورية التي احتلتها في خرق صريح لاتفاقية الهدنة للعام 1974. وتعيد المجموعة تأكيدها على أن هضبة الجولان هي أرض سورية محتلة ورفضها لقرار إسرائيل ضمها وفرض سيادتها عليه. كما تدين المجموعة استمرار الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ل5 مواقع في الجنوب اللبناني وتعيين منطقتين عازلتين ضمن الأراضي اللبنانية ومنع الوصول لهما ما يشكل انتهاكا لسيادة لبنان وللقرار 1701 ونؤكد على ضرورة اطلاع مجلس الأمن بمسؤولياته وإلزام إسرائيل بالانسحاب الكامل من كافة الأراضي اللبنانية المحتلة حتى الحدود المعترف بها دوليا وفق القرار 1701 ونحذر من تداعيات تأخير انسحابها على تثبيت الاستقرار. كما نشيد بالتقدم في نشر الجيش اللبناني في منطقة جنوب الليطاني ونؤكد الوقوف مع لبنان ودعم أمنه واستقراره وحفظ سيادته. ختاما السيد الرئيس، ندعو مجددا إلى تكاتف المجتمع الدولي في وقف الحرب على غزة والسماح بوصول المساعدات إلى الشعب الفلسطيني ووقف الانتهاكات الإسرائيلية في جميع مناطق الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة ودعم صمود الشعب الفلسطيني الشقيق على أرضه. كما نؤكد وقوفنا إلى جانب الأشقاء الفلسطينيين في سعيهم لنيل حقوقهم المشروعة بشكل كامل وفي مقدمتها حقهم في الحرية والدولة المستقلة ذات السيادة على ترابهم الوطني على أساس حل الدولتين ومبادرة السلام العربية سبيلا وحيدا لتحقيق السلام الشامل والعادل والدائم الذي يضمن الأمن والاستقرار لمنطقتنا برمتها. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank the representative of Jordan for the statement. The permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. And I'm terribly sorry to take the floor again, but there is need for a few additional comments. 1 million Palestinians arrested over the last decades are terrorists. 1 million of them. The 10,000 who are still in Israeli jails are terrorists. The children, the teachers, the doctors, the human rights defenders, all terrorists? You consider our people terrorists, all of them, whether from different political groups or factions or NGOs, even the most notable ones. Our civilians from before the birth till after their death, all terrorists in your book. These were considered by who? By your military courts, built to subjugate and oppress our people, to enforce illegal military orders that criminalize all civilians by, what is it? Okay, by that civilians, all civilians' actions by Palestinians, including their very existence or their land, and to allow all Israelis' crimes in full impunity. And how many Israelis were held accountable for their crimes against the Palestinian people, from indiscriminate killing to unlawfully stealing our land? How many? Palestinian prisoners are well treated, you claim, including the dozens killed while in custody. Or you mean those beaten, tortured, and raped? Your occupation forces conducted mass arrests of Palestinians, torturing them, then release some of them, disappear some of them, keep in custody and detentions many of them, whether charges exist against them or not. Your courts fail every international standard and have even refused to condemn or charge those responsible for torture. We resorted to international courts and accepted their jurisdiction. You refused to do the same, as your leaders are responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and you are the spokesperson of this criminal enterprise, and yet want to offer lessons to the world. How many Israeli leaders and members of Israeli occupation forces would be in jail if they were to finally face independent and impartial justice? Many of them, starting with the Israeli Prime Minister, would be in jail. As for your military aggression in all Palestinian cities, it has nothing to do with security and everything to do with your colonial aggression and occupation. Thank you, Madam President.
I take note of the statement and comments made by the representative of the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine. I'd just like to remind all members that this is a place of respect and decorum. So everyone is reminded to refrain from comments of a personal or disrespectful nature. The representative of Israel has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. Mansour, you can continue with the manipulation and inflation of numbers, but there are facts. And everything I said today, I stand behind it. Your failures in Jenin, your failures in Tulkarem, the weakness of the Palestinian Authority, and I think most importantly is the weakness of your leadership to build a better future for the Palestinian by condemning Hamas. President Abbas was not able to condemn Hamas even once since October 7th. Neither all the ministers in the Palestinian Authority, not one condemnation, and even yourself and your team sitting here preaching, criticizing, but once to condemn the terror of Hamas. The day you will be capable of doing that, you can speak about a future for the Palestinian people. But unfortunately, it's much easier to incite against Israel, to blame us for everything, and without fighting the radicals. And I would advise you, because you are very involved, and I respect that, but look at other countries in the region. When you have leadership which is too weak to confront the radicals, look where they are today. And when you have strong leadership in the Arab countries who are facing the radicals, look the way they have been able to bring their societies. And unfortunately, the way that the Palestinian Authority leadership is going, with the leadership of President Abbas and others and yourself, is to allow the radicals to control the narrative, to allow the radicals to continue with the indoctrination of the next generation. And you know that people are celebrating October 7th, not in Gaza. They are doing it in Ramallah, in Jenin, in Tulkarem. You know, we will defend ourselves, but think about the future of the Palestinian people. Thank you very much, Madam President.
And I also take note of the statement and comments and remind again all members that this is a place of respect and decorum. The representative of the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine has asked the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
And I listen and respect your ruling, but I hope that that ruling to be enforced. But be that as it may, those who lecture us about our conduct, and they do not look about the conducts in the streets of Tel Aviv and in other places in Israel, are not the ones who are qualified to lecture us about the conduct of my government. And let me also say, did we hear in this chamber a condemnation of a single behavior of an Israeli leader or officer or a diplomat, of the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinian children and women and attacks against our people everywhere, including in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. So those who have such kind of behavior are the least to lecture us here in this chamber about a good conduct and who is...
Members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on this subject. The meeting is adjourned.